The man didn't knock. He walked into the Mercer ranch yard like he owned it already, 3 hired guns at his back, a cigarette burning between his fingers, and a folded document he slapped against Silas Mercer's chest hard enough to make the rancher stumble backward into the fence post. "Sign it," Rutherford Kane said. His voice had the flat quality of a man who'd never been told no and intended to keep it that way. "I'm buying your debt from the bank Monday morning. You can sign now like a reasonable man, or I'll have you removed from this property like the squatter you're about to become." One of his men laughed. The other 2 didn't bother. Silas looked down at the paper, looked up at Kane, didn't say a word. Kane took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly toward the sky. "You've got a week, Mercer. Maybe less." Then he turned and walked back to his horse without a second glance, as though the decision was already made, the ranch already gone, and Silas Mercer already forgotten. If you've ever felt like the ground was disappearing beneath your feet and you couldn't stop it no matter how hard you fought, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next will surprise you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's begin. Silas Mercer had not slept well in 3 years. That wasn't something he told people. It wasn't the kind of thing a man said out loud in Hatchford, Wyoming, where admitting weakness was about as welcome as a drought in August, which was to say it happened all the time, but nobody wanted to hear about it. So he kept it to himself, the way he kept most things, quietly and at considerable cost. He was 38 years old and he looked closer to 45, not because life had been cruel to him in obvious ways, but because it had been persistent. His late wife, Clara, had died 26 months ago from a fever that moved through her in 10 terrible days, and the grief had settled into him the way cold settles into old timber, deep, invisible from the outside, but present in everything. In the way he held his coffee mug without drinking from it, in the way he sometimes stood in the doorway of the bedroom they had shared and looked at the floor rather than the bed because looking at the bed was still too much. The ranch had suffered along with him. Not from neglect exactly, Silas was not a careless man, but from a particular kind of paralysis that comes when a person loses the reason they were working in the first place. Clara had loved this land. She had named the hills and talked to the cattle and kept a kitchen garden that somehow survived Wyoming's brutal summers through sheer stubbornness and attention. Without her, the garden went to weeds. The fences went unmended in the far pastures. The books stopped being balanced with the same precision, and by the time Silas noticed what was happening to the numbers, he was already too deep in debt to dig out easily. 3 weeks before Rutherford Kane arrived with his hired men and his folded document, the bank had informed Silas that his loan was in default. The manager, a soft-handed man named Aldrich who wore the same nervous expression whether delivering good news or bad, had shuffled papers on his desk and avoided direct eye contact and suggested delicately that Silas consider alternative arrangements. "What kind of alternative arrangements?" Silas had said. It wasn't really a question. Aldrich had shuffled more papers. "Well, there are investors interested in the Mercer parcel. Mr. Kane in particular has expressed..." "No. Mr. Mercer, the debt is..." I said no. He'd walked out of the bank and stood on the main street of Hatchford in the October wind and thought about Clara, which he always did when things got bad. And then he'd thought about his father, who had built the original ranch house with his own hands and died proud of it. And something inside Silas had locked down hard and final, the way a man's jaw locks when he's decided something. He was not going to lose that ranch. What he did next was not something he was proud of. Exactly. He was not embarrassed by it, but it sat strangely with him. The practicality of it, the almost business-like quality of desperation. He wrote to a placement agency in Chicago that his neighbor Dolan had mentioned once, probably as a joke, a service that matched frontier ranchers with women seeking marriages in the West. Dolan had laughed when he brought it up. Silas had not laughed, but he hadn't pursued it either. That had been 18 months ago. He pursued it now. He wrote a letter that was honest to the point of being blunt. 38, widower, working ranch in moderate financial difficulty, no particular charm to speak of, looking for a practical arrangement that benefited both parties. He offered a home, shared income from the ranch once it recovered, and his word that he would be respectful and fair. He did not offer romance. He did not promise things he couldn't deliver. The agency wrote back within 2 weeks. They had a candidate, they said. A woman named Vivienne Laurent, 27, originally from the Eastern Seaboard, currently residing in Chicago. References available upon request. She was described briefly and administratively as capable, educated, and adaptable. There was a photograph enclosed. Silas looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put it face down on the kitchen table and wrote back confirming the arrangement, because looking at it too long felt like getting ahead of himself in a way that would only end badly. He did not look at the photograph again. He told himself it didn't matter what she looked like. He told himself that quite a few times over the following weeks, which probably meant it mattered more than he wanted to admit. The stagecoach from Cheyenne arrived in Hatchford on a Thursday afternoon in early November, running 40 minutes late because one of the horses had thrown a shoe outside Larson Creek. Silas stood on the platform with his hat in his hands and the particular stillness of a man who has committed to something and is now waiting to discover what exactly he has committed to. He had not told anyone in town about the arrangement. He'd meant to figure out how, but the words had never arranged themselves into a sentence he was willing to say out loud. And then it was Thursday, and the stage was coming. There were 4 other passengers on the coach. He saw them get off one at a time. A traveling salesman with a case of samples, an elderly couple visiting relatives, a young man who looked like he'd had a hard trip and wanted to lie down somewhere. And then Vivienne Laurent stepped off the stagecoach. Silas had looked at that photograph twice. He had told himself it didn't matter. He had prepared himself as much as a man can prepare himself for the reality of meeting a stranger who was about to become his wife. He was not prepared. He didn't have the right word for it, and he was not a man who spent much time searching for words. She was tall with dark hair, pinned back in a practical way that had mostly survived the journey, and she had the kind of face that people looked at twice without quite knowing why they'd done it. But it wasn't just that. It was the way she stood when she stepped off the coach, taking in Hatchford with a calm, appraising look that suggested she had seen harder places and formed accurate opinions about them quickly. She held a single traveling bag in her right hand and a smaller case in her left, and she looked neither delighted nor disappointed. She looked like a woman assessing a situation. Her eyes found him across the platform. She walked toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady and clear, and she offered her hand like a businesswoman concluding a meeting. "I am Vivienne Laurent. I imagine we should talk before we make anything official." Silas shook her hand. "I imagine we should," he said. Howe was aware, with the part of his brain that functioned independently of the part currently having some kind of internal emergency, that several people on the platform were watching them. Mrs. Dolores Yunt, who had lived in Hatchford for 40 years and treated the town's social information as her personal property, was pretending to examine a notice board while angled toward them at an angle that was not subtle. "Is there somewhere we can sit down?" Vivienne asked. "I've been in that coach for 6 hours, and I would genuinely appreciate a cup of coffee before we discuss anything." "Fenwick's," Silas said. "Down the street. I see it," she said, and started walking. He fell into step beside her. Behind them, he heard Mrs. Yunt's sharp intake of breath, which meant the story was already forming. Fenwick's was the closest thing Hatchford had to a restaurant. Mostly a counter with stools and 4 tables with mismatched chairs, run by a man named Pete Fenwick, who'd come to Wyoming from Ohio 30 years ago intending to prospect for silver, and had ended up, through a series of decisions he still couldn't fully explain, running a lunch counter instead. Pete poured their coffee without being asked and then made himself very busy at the far end of the counter, which was his way of eavesdropping while appearing not to. Vivienne wrapped both hands around the mug and drank before she said anything else. Then she set it down, looked at Silas directly, and said, "Tell me what the ranch actually looks like. Not the arrangement. I've read the arrangement. Tell me what condition it's actually in." He told her. He was honest about it, more honest than he'd been in the letter, because something about the way she asked made it feel like lying would be pointless. He told her about the debt, the unmended fences, the south pasture that had gone to scrub, the cattle numbers that were half what they should be, the equipment that needed replacing. He laid it out flat, the way you'd describe a patient to a doctor. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How much debt?" she said. He told her the number. She didn't flinch. "What's your water situation?" That surprised him. "Creek runs through the north edge of the property. Reliable. Never gone dry in my father's time or mine." "How much acreage is currently being used productively?" He did a quick calculation in his head and gave her a rough figure. She nodded slowly, like something was adding up. "The south pasture that went to scrub." "What kind of scrub?" "Mostly sage and rabbit brush, some bunch grass holding on underneath." "That's restorable," she said. "It'd take work and a season, but it's restorable." She picked up her coffee again. I'm not going to tell you I can fix everything. I'm not going to promise you the ranch will be prosperous within 6 months because I don't know that yet. But I know land, and I know how to work, and I know that a place with reliable water and recoverable pasture has something to work with. She paused. I want to be clear about something else. Go ahead, Silas said. I read your letter carefully. You were honest about what you were offering and what you weren't. I appreciated that. I want to be equally honest. She met his eyes. I need somewhere I can stay. Somewhere permanent that belongs to me in some legal sense, somewhere outside a city. The reasons for that are mine, and I'm not prepared to discuss them today. What I'm prepared to do is work for this arrangement the same way you are, practically and with full effort. If that sounds acceptable to you, then I'm willing to proceed. Silas looked at her for a moment. She held his gaze without difficulty, like a woman who had held more uncomfortable gazes than this and come through them fine. Sounds acceptable, he said. They were married that afternoon by Judge Peabody, with Pete Fenwick and his wife serving as witnesses because they were available, and Silas hadn't thought to arrange anyone else. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Vivian signed the documents in a clear, precise hand. Silas signed them in the slightly cramped way of a man who didn't write much. Afterward, driving back to the ranch in the wagon, they didn't talk much. The sky was doing something dramatic with clouds and the last of the afternoon light, and the wind had picked up with a cold edge to it that meant the first real cold snap was coming. It's beautiful country, Vivian said, looking out at the hills. Can be, Silas said. What's that ridge called? She pointed north toward the long line of elevated ground that ran along the property's border. My father called it the Shoulder. Doesn't have an official name. She looked at it a moment longer. That makes sense, she said, like it was a reasonable name for a ridge, and that was the end of the conversation until they reached the ranch. He showed her through the house without ceremony. It was clean. He had cleaned it, which had taken the better part of 2 days, but it was also clearly a house that had been maintained by a man alone, which meant functional and bare of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. Clara's things were gone from the common areas. He had not touched the bedroom yet, which he told himself was because there hadn't been time. Vivian moved through each room with the same assessing quality she'd had at the station, noting things without commenting on most of them. In the kitchen, she opened 2 cabinet doors and looked at the arrangement of supplies. In the back room, she looked at the tools hanging on the wall and identified several of them by type. In the main bedroom, she stood in the doorway and said, without any particular weight, "Is this where you sleep?" "Usually," Silas said. "There's a second room, smaller. I've made it up for you." She turned to look at him. "Mr. Mercer, Silas. Silas." She seemed to consider the name briefly, as if trying it out. "That works for me. The smaller room is fine." She paused. "For now" was not said aloud, but it hung in the air with the careful neutrality of something that didn't need to be said yet. He showed her the second room, which had been his father's study and still smelled faintly of old books despite having contained no books for years. She set her bags down on the narrow bed, looked around at the walls and said, "I can make this work." She wasn't talking about the room. The next morning, she was up before him. He came out of the bedroom at 5:30, expecting to be the first person awake, as he had been every morning for the past 3 years, and found Vivian in the kitchen with a fire already going and coffee already made, wearing a work dress and boots with the kind of practicality that suggested she'd done this before. She had also, somehow, produced a breakfast that involved eggs he hadn't known he had, and biscuits whose existence he could not account for. "There were eggs in the cold cellar," she said without looking up from the pan. "Did you know you had 12 pounds of flour down there?" "I might have known that," Silas said. "You're going to need to start writing things down," she told him, in the way of someone stating a logistical fact rather than criticizing. "I can keep track of the kitchen inventory, but you'll need to tell me where things are kept and what the usual schedule is." "There isn't much of a schedule," he admitted. She looked at him then, briefly. "There will be." He ate the breakfast, which was considerably better than what he normally made, and then they went outside together, and she walked the property with him in the cold November morning with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes taking in everything. The fences that needed work, the cattle in the north pasture, the barn with its roof that had developed a soft spot over the winter, the south pasture that he'd described as gone to scrub. She stood at the edge of the south pasture for a while without talking. "You said it was bad," she said finally. "It is bad. It's not as bad as I expected." She bent down and pushed some of the dead sage aside with her boot, looking at what was underneath. "The soil's still good. You can see the grass trying to come back along this edge where the wind's not as strong." She stood up. If we get cattle on this section in spring rotation and do some targeted clearing this winter, you'll have usable pasture by June. You know cattle rotation? She looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite exasperation, something between the two. My father raised horses. My uncle had a cattle operation in Virginia before the war ruined it. I spent summers there until I was 15. She paused. I know more about land than I probably let on in my letter. Why didn't you say so in your letter? She was quiet for a beat. I didn't want you to think I was selling myself as something I might not be able to deliver. She looked back at the pasture. I wanted to see it first. It was the most personal thing she had said to him, and he wasn't sure what to do with it, so he didn't do anything. He just nodded, and they kept walking. By the end of the first week, it was clear to Silas that Vivienne Laurent was not the woman he had expected in any version of his expectations. He had imagined, when he allowed himself to imagine it, which wasn't often, someone quiet and perhaps a little frightened, a woman in reduced circumstances willing to accept what she could get. That description did not remotely fit the person currently reorganizing his supply shed and explaining to him with patient precision why the way he'd been storing his fence wire was leading to corrosion at the connection points. She worked without appearing to try hard, which was somehow more impressive than obvious effort. She learned the cattle by name faster than some hired hands he'd had for months. She fixed a section of fence in the northwest corner that he'd been meaning to get to for 2 seasons, doing it properly, the post set right, and the wire tensioned correctly. She started a ledger for the ranch accounts, not taking it over exactly, but organizing it in a way that made the numbers easier to see, and some of what she showed him in that ledger surprised him. You're spending more on feed than you need to, she told him one evening, the ledger open between them on the kitchen table. You're buying from Morrison's at retail when you could be buying direct from the Hanson grain operation 15 miles east. It's a longer drive, but the price differential over a year is, she did a quick calculation in her head, probably close to $200. I didn't know the Hansons sold direct. They do. I asked around in town yesterday when I went for supplies. She paused. I also talked to Ed Kelly at the feed store. He mentioned you have a credit account there that you haven't been keeping up with. Silas felt his jaw tighten slightly. I know about the Kelly account. I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying that if we pay it down over the next 2 months with what we save from switching to the Hanson grain, we can close that account by spring and remove one of the things Kane might be able to use as leverage. He looked at her. What do you know about Kane? She met his gaze evenly. I listened in town. People talk, especially when a new face shows up with questions. Mr. Kane's interest in this property isn't new, and the way he went about approaching you with that document, intimidation without immediate legal standing, suggests he's waiting to accumulate enough of your debt instruments before he moves formally. She folded her hands on the table. He's done this before. The Reedy place and the Vance property 2 years ago. Both times the original owners were already in financial difficulty when he made his approach. Silas was quiet for a moment. He wasn't sure whether he was more surprised by the information or by the fact that she'd gathered it in a week. You've been busy, he said. We can't afford not to be. The first real confrontation with the town came in Silas's second week with Vivienne at Aldrich's Mercantile. Not the bank, the general store run by Aldrich's brother, which was confusing to people who were new to Hatchford and occasionally to people who weren't. They had gone together to pick up a supply order, and Silas had noticed the shift in the room the moment they walked in. The slight pause in conversation, the angle of heads turning without quite turning, the particular quality of attention that meant people were working hard to appear not to be paying attention. He'd grown up in Hatchford. He knew what it looked like when the town was forming an opinion. Mrs. Yount was there, of course. She was almost always there when something was happening. She was examining bolts of fabric with a concentration that was entirely unconvincing. Mr. Mercer, she said, without quite greeting him. Her eyes moved to Vivienne with the particular quality of a woman who has already reached a verdict and is now seeking confirmation. And this must be your... The pause was half a second too long. Wife. Vivienne Mercer, Vivienne said. She extended her hand. Mrs. Yount shook it as briefly as possible. Where are you from, dear? Chicago most recently, Vivienne said. Before that, the East Coast, Massachusetts for a time. And you came all this way for another half-second pause. Ranch life. I came for my husband, Vivienne said. Calm, untroubled, like she was commenting on the weather. The ranch is an added benefit. Something flickered in Mrs. Yount's expression. Surprise, Silas thought, and not pleasant surprise. She had expected discomfort, and Vivian had not provided it. Of course, Mrs. Yount said, and turned back to her fabric. In the wagon on the way back, Vivian said, she'll spread whatever version of this makes the most interesting story. She always does, Silas said. What will people believe? He thought about it honestly. Some will think you're here for my money, which is funny because I don't have much. Some will think there's something you're running from. He paused. Some people will just think you're a mail order bride and leave it at that. And what do you think they'll say about you? That I'm a fool who got taken in by a pretty face. She was quiet for a moment. Does that bother you? It bothers me the same way most things people say about me bother me, he said. Which is that I care more than I'd like to admit and less than they'd like me to. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh, not quite one, but close. That's a very precise answer. I've had a while to figure out how I feel about the people in this town. The cold snap hit 3 days later. A hard Wyoming winter, moving in fast from the north, dropping the temperature 15 degrees overnight and bringing a dusting of early snow. Silas had been watching the sky and had some of the preparations already made, but there were still cattle to move, water lines to check, and a section of barn roof that was now significantly more urgent. He was on the barn roof at 7 in the morning, trying to nail down a section of loose sheathing before the next round of cold came through, when the ladder slipped. He caught himself on the edge of the roof, just caught himself, both hands gripping the worn wood, his legs dangling off the eaves, and held there for a moment that seemed considerably longer than it was. Don't let go, Vivian said from directly below him. He hadn't heard her come out. She had the ladder repositioned before he could say anything, her shoulder against it, one hand on the bottom rung, and she held it steady with a grip that was more solid than he'd expected while he found his footing and climbed down. He stood on the ground, breathing for a moment. You were going to do that alone, she said. It was not a question. I do most things alone, he said. I noticed. She looked up at the roof. I can hold the ladder while you finish, or I can nail if you tell me where. You know how to nail sheathing? She picked up the hammer he'd left on the ground and turned it over in her hands with a practical familiarity. My uncle taught me. He said knowing how to fix a roof was the difference between a farming woman and a useless one. Your uncle sounds like a practical man. He was. Something crossed her face, quick and gone. He died in 82. Silas held out his hand for the hammer. I'll do the nailing. You hold the ladder. They finished the roof section in an hour, working without much talk, passing tools and calling out measurements in the shorthand of people who have done physical work together long enough to develop efficiency. They hadn't, but they managed it anyway. In town that afternoon, picking up supplies alone because Vivian had stayed to check on a heifer that had been off her feed, Silas ran into Dale Morrow, who ran the hardware store and was one of the people in Hatchford he had known long enough to call a friend in most seasons. Here you got yourself a wife, Dale said, with the particular tone of someone who has heard several versions of this fact and hasn't quite decided what to make of them. I do, Silas said. Pretty, they say. They're right. Dale looked at him. You sure about this, Silas? I mean, a woman from the city, a stranger, the situation with the ranch. Pretty sure, Silas said. What do you know about her, really? Silas thought about that. He thought about what he actually knew. The way she'd assessed the south pasture, the accounting she'd done in the ledger, the steadiness with which she'd held the ladder. He thought about the way she'd looked at Kane's document when he'd shown it to her, not with fear, but with the calculating focus of someone reading a problem that had a solution. Enough, he said. I know enough. Dale gave him a look that suggested this was not satisfying, but Dale also knew when Silas was done talking about something, so he let it go. The second confrontation with Kane happened at the end of November, not in person this time, but through a message delivered by his man Teague, a thin-faced individual who came to the ranch door on a Wednesday morning and handed Silas a letter without saying anything. Silas read it and handed it to Vivian without comment. The letter was polite in the way of things that are not actually polite. It noted that Silas's loan with Clearwater Bank would be formally transferred to Kane Capital Investment as of December 1st. It offered, one final time, the opportunity to negotiate a sale at fair market value before the debt transfer was finalized. It did not say what would happen if the offer was declined, but it didn't need to. Vivian read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at the window for a moment. He's moving faster than I expected, she said. Is that a problem? It means we have less time. She stood up. I need to go to the county offices in Clearwater. Then you manage here for 2 days? What are you going to the county offices for? She looked at him. I want to see the original deed filings for this property and the Reedy and Vance parcels. And I want to talk to whoever handles the federal land records. She paused. There's something in the pattern of how Kane operates that I want to understand better before he moves. Silas looked at her for a moment. What made you think to look at the other parcels? She was quiet for a beat, just a beat, but he caught it. I've seen this kind of thing before. Not here, somewhere else. She picked up the letter and folded it carefully. The pattern is the same. Buy up debt, manufacture urgency, push until the owner runs out of options. The only difference is what happens when someone doesn't run. What does happen? She met his eyes. That's what I'm going to find out. She left the next morning on the early stage to Clearwater, carrying only a small bag and the careful, contained expression she wore when she was thinking harder than she was showing. Silas watched the stage go from the top of the ridge he thought of as the shoulder, the way his father used to watch for weather. He went back to the ranch and found the heifer Vivian had been worried about had developed a proper fever overnight, which meant the next 6 hours were consumed with the urgent practical problem of a sick animal, which was the kind of thing the ranch delivered with reliable regularity when a man needed time to think. Hy was elbow deep in the problem when the next visitor arrived. Not Kane this time, and not Teague, but 3 men from town whose names he knew. Jessup, who ran the mill, and 2 of the town council members whose opinion of themselves significantly exceeded what Silas considered their value. They stood in the yard in a self-important cluster and waited for him to come out of the barn. Silas, Jessup said, we need to talk. I'm in the middle of something, Silas said. It's about your wife. He came out of the barn. What about her? Jessup had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. One of the council members did not have this decency and said, there are concerns about who she is, where she came from, whether this marriage is, he searched for the right word, what it appears to be. It's a marriage, Silas said. That's what it appears to be, and that's what it is. People are talking about the fact that you used an agency, the other council member said. That's legal. Legal and acceptable aren't always the same thing in a community. Silas looked at these 3 men. He had known all of them for years. He had tolerated their opinions about things that were not their business for years. He had done this because Hatchford was small and you had to get along with the people in a small place, and mostly it hadn't cost him much. Let me be clear about something, he said. My wife is a legal resident of this county, legally married to me, working this land as hard as or harder than I am. Her business before she came here is her business. The marriage is legitimate and not subject to community approval. He looked at each of them in turn. If there's something specific you want to say to me about something specific she's done, I'll hear it. Otherwise, I'd appreciate you finding somewhere else to be. Jessup looked at him for a moment. Nobody's trying to cause trouble, Silas. Then don't, Silas said. He went back into the barn. He heard them leave. He went back to the heifer and spent another 2 hours with her until her breathing steadied and she drank a little, and then he stood up with aching knees and a back that had been bothering him since summer. And he thought about Vivian at the county records office, looking at deed filings and asking careful questions. And he thought about the way she'd held the ladder and assessed the south pasture and read Kane's letter without flinching. He thought about what he didn't know about her. He thought about the beat of hesitation before she said she'd seen this kind of thing before. He thought about the photograph he'd looked at and then put face down on the table. He did not know what she was running from. He knew she was running from something. He had known it since the platform, since the way she'd assessed Hatchford, the way you assess a place for cover, for roots, for whether it would do. He thought he should probably be more concerned about that than he was. The heifer was better by morning. Vivian came back on the afternoon stage 2 days later, slightly travel-worn, carrying a leather case he hadn't seen before that seemed heavier than when she'd left. She came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and poured herself coffee without taking her coat off, and he waited. The Reedy parcel, she said. The transfer of debt was facilitated by a company called Meridian Capital. The Vance property, the same. Meridian Capital is a subsidiary, several layers removed, but traceable if you know what you're looking for. She opened the leather case and spread several pages across the table. It connects ultimately to a holding company based in New Orleans with significant interest in the Gulf shipping trade. Silas looked at the papers. He was not a man who had spent much time in county records offices, and some of what he was looking at was the kind of legal and financial language that required translation. What does a Gulf shipping company want with Wyoming cattle land? Land is land, Vivian said. It's an asset. It appreciates. And if you can assemble enough of it, she stopped. He looked at her. She was looking at the papers, and something in her expression had shifted. Not the steady, calculating focus he'd come to associate with her, but something underneath it, something more personal and less controlled. You know something else, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Vivian. The holding company in New Orleans, she said, and her voice was careful in the way of someone choosing words precisely. I've seen that name before, in a different context, a very different context. She looked up at him. I need to make some inquiries before I say more. I could be wrong. But you don't think you're wrong. She held his gaze. No, she said, I don't think I'm wrong. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and the clouds coming in from the north had the low, heavy look of real weather. Silas looked at the papers on the table and then at his wife, who was still in her coat, who had come back from Clearwater with information and a leather case and an expression he was now certain she had been carrying since long before she stepped off that stagecoach in Hatchford. He thought about Dale asking what he knew about her, really. He thought about the heifer in the barn and the south pasture and the 11 minutes it had taken Judge Peabody to marry them. He thought, whatever she's not telling me, she came back. Tell me what you need, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something, he thought, something she hadn't decided yet. Time, she said finally, and your trust. The wind rattled the kitchen window. Somewhere in the north pasture, a cow complained about the weather. All right, Silas said. He had said all right, and meant it. But that night, he lay awake for a long time listening to the wind work on the house and thinking about what it actually meant to trust someone you had known for less than a month. Trust was not a thing Silas Mercer extended easily. This was not a character flaw he was particularly ashamed of. It was more a condition of his life, the way bad knees are a condition of a life spent on horseback. Clara had been the person he trusted completely, and losing her had not so much broken that capacity as reduced it to something careful and slow, like a creek that had been dammed not to stop the water entirely, but to control where it went. He trusted that Vivian would do what she said she would do. He trusted her competence, which was visible and demonstrated and hard to argue with. He trusted, in some way he couldn't quite articulate, that she was not deceiving him for the reasons the town suspected. For money, for status, for some scheme that would collapse his life further. What he didn't trust was the space around her edges, the things she didn't say, the beat of hesitation before certain answers. The leather case sitting on the kitchen table that she'd carried back from Clearwater and not opened again since the night she'd returned. He fell asleep sometime after midnight and woke at 5 to find the cold had deepened overnight and there was a solid 2 inches of new snow on the ground. December came in hard and stayed that way. The work did not stop for winter. If anything, it intensified, because cold weather created a particular category of urgent problems that needed immediate attention, while also making the solving of them considerably more miserable. Water lines that froze, cattle that needed extra feed and more frequent checks. Equipment that behaved differently in cold and needed more careful handling to avoid breakdowns that could not be fixed until spring. Vivian did not slow down with the cold. If anything, she seemed to operate better in it, more focused, more efficient, like someone who had spent enough time in genuinely difficult conditions that a Wyoming December did not register as an emergency. She added a second layer under her coat and kept working. They developed, over those weeks, something that was not exactly a routine but had some of the qualities of one. She was up before him, he was outside before her. She handled the kitchen accounts and the ledger in the evenings. He handled the equipment and the cattle movements during the day. They split the fence work and the supply runs depending on who was needed where. They ate together without much ceremony and talked about the practical things. The heifer who was still off her feed, the section of south pasture she wanted to start clearing in January, the feed order from the Hansen operation that had arrived and proved to be exactly what she'd estimated. You were right about the price differential, he told her one evening. Over a full year, it's probably closer to $220. I was conservative, she said. She was working through the ledger while he cleaned the condensation from the window casings, something he'd been meaning to do since October and which she had pointed out, with characteristic directness, was contributing to the rot at the lower sill. I didn't want to oversell the projection before I had the actual numbers. Most people would have sold the higher number. Most people want to be believed more than they want to be accurate, she said. I'd rather be accurate. He found he had no argument with that. What he hadn't expected, and what unsettled him pleasantly in a way he couldn't quite name, was the laughter. Not from her specifically, though she had a dry, precise sense of humor that surfaced in unexpected moments, but from him. He had not laughed much in 3 years. The capacity had felt like something misplaced rather than lost, the way you misplace a tool and go weeks without it before suddenly needing it again. Vivian made him laugh twice in the same week in mid-December, both times without appearing to try particularly hard. The first time was when she described with perfect deadpan delivery her attempt to negotiate with a bull who had opinions about being moved to the north pasture. The second was when she read aloud a letter from the placement agency in Chicago following up on the arrangement's progress and asking, with bureaucratic sincerity, whether both parties were satisfactorily adjusting to the terms of the agreement. "Are you satisfactorily adjusting?" she asked, holding the letter at arm's length like it had an odor. "Marginally," he said. "I'll tell them marginally." She folded the letter. "I'll be very precise about it." He laughed. It came out differently than he expected, less rusty than he would have predicted, more genuine. She looked at him when he did it, quickly and then away as though she hadn't meant to look. The good things were real. He was not imagining the good things. But December also brought the letter from Clearwater Bank that formalized what Kane had promised. The debt transfer was complete. The Mercer Ranch loan was now held by Meridian Capital, a subsidiary of Kane's operation, effective December 1st. The letter was professionally written and entirely menacing in its courtesy. Vivian read it and then set it aside in the leather case with the other documents she'd brought back from Clearwater. "What do you have in there?" Silas asked. He hadn't pushed before. He was pushing now, carefully. "Records," she said. "Property filings, corporate registrations, some correspondence I've been gathering." She paused. "Letters." "Whose letters?" She looked at him. There was a quality to her expression he hadn't seen before. Not the calculation, not the steadiness, but something underneath those things that was older and more tired. "Mine," she said. "And some that were sent to me, and some that were never sent to me, but that I came into possession of anyway, through means I'd rather not explain right now." He sat down at the kitchen table. "Vivian, the holding company in New Orleans that you recognized, you need to tell me more than you have." She was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Outside, the wind picked up and a branch from the cottonwood hit the side of the house and made them both look toward the window out of reflex. "His name is Armand Voss," she said. The name didn't mean anything to Silas. He waited. "He's based in New Orleans. He has legitimate businesses, shipping, a trading company, interests in several banks along the Gulf Coast. He is respected in certain circles and well connected in ways that have kept him protected for a long time." She sat down across from him. "He is also the man I was supposed to marry." Silas was quiet. "Not supposed to marry the way you might understand it," she said. "Not a courtship. It was arranged by my father, who owed Voss a significant sum of money and had no other way to pay it. My father is not a good man, and I don't say that easily." She looked at her hands on the table. "Voss wanted access to my family's land holdings in Virginia and the Carolinas. He also wanted—" She stopped, started again. "He wanted a wife who had the kind of background that would make him respectable in circles he was trying to access. I was useful to him in a specific way. That's all I ever was." "You left," Silas said. "I left. And before I left, I took everything I could find, documents, correspondence, financial records that showed what Voss was actually doing, not the shipping business, the other things." She met his eyes. "He's been expanding north, buying up land through intermediaries, establishing financial footholds in territories and new states. The Gulf shipping is legitimate. The land acquisition operation is how he cleans money from things that are not legitimate." She paused. "Kane is one of his men. Not locally. Kane thinks he's operating independently, and Voss allows him to think that. But the money behind Meridian Capital traces back to Voss. I followed the trail when I was in Clearwater." Silas sat with that for a moment. "How long has he been looking for you?" "Since 3 weeks after I left, approximately 2 years." She said it flatly, but something in the set of her shoulders carried the weight of what 2 years of that felt like. "I have been careful. I moved several times. I worked when I could and kept a low profile. But eventually staying in one city becomes—" she seemed to search for the right word. "It becomes visible. You leave traces. People remember you." "And the agency?" "The agency was carefully chosen. Rural placement, frontier territory. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought it would be somewhere he wasn't looking yet. Wyoming." She looked toward the window. "I chose well, for a while. But he found his way here anyway. Not because of me, I don't think. Not yet. Kane was already operating in this territory before I arrived. It may be coincidence." She paused. "Or it may not be. I don't know yet." Silas turned that over. The documents you took, the evidence. It's enough to cause him serious problems if it reaches the right federal authorities. Financial fraud. Wire fraud, in modern terms. Connections to operations that would interest the federal marshals significantly. She folded her hands. I've been waiting for the right moment and the right situation to deliver it. Alone, moving from city to city, I had no standing. If I walked into a federal office alone with documents accusing Armand Voss of financial crimes, I would have been, she made a small, humorless gesture, handled. Voss has connections. He would have known about it before I left the building. Silas looked at her. So, you needed somewhere to stand. I needed somewhere that was mine, legally. Somewhere I was a resident, a property holder, someone with standing, and a name attached to a real place. She held his gaze. I should have told you this from the beginning. I know that, but I didn't know you, and I needed to... She stopped. I needed to know if you were the kind of man who would run from it. And... She was quiet for a beat. You went back into the barn, she said, when Jessup and the councilmen came and said what they said. You went back in and finished what you were doing. He was not entirely sure what to make of being trusted because of how he had walked away from 3 men in his yard, but he understood what she was saying. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to let me handle this my way, and I need you to be prepared for the possibility that when Voss finds out, and he will find out eventually, he will not simply send a legal letter. Like Kane, Silas said. Kane is a businessman. He operates within a certain threshold. Voss, she looked at the window again. Voss operates at a different threshold. The fire in the kitchen stove popped and settled. Silas looked at the leather case on the table and then at the woman across from him who had carried it across 2 years and 2,000 miles and set it down in his kitchen because she needed somewhere to stand. All right, he said, for the second time. She looked at him like she was checking whether he meant it. He meant it. The week before Christmas, something shifted in the town's attitude, and it shifted in a direction nobody had quite predicted. It came from an unlikely source, Ed Kelly at the feed store, who was not known for progressive opinions about much of anything, but who told 3 separate customers that Vivian Mercer had come in and paid down the full balance of the ranch's credit account, in cash from ranch earnings, and had done it without any drama or any expectation of credit for it. Just paid it and left, Ed reportedly said. Thanked me like I'd done her a favor. The story spread the way things spread in small towns, which is to say immediately and with embellishments that were mostly minor. By the time it reached Mrs. Yount, it had acquired a detail about Vivian also repairing the fence along the road to the Kelly property, which was not true, but which was the kind of thing people wanted to be true. What was true? The ranch account at Kelly's was paid. What was also true? Vivian had, on a drive back from the Hanson grain operation, stopped and rehung a gate on the Brennan family's property that had been hanging half off its post since September, because she had wire and tools in the wagon and the job took 20 minutes and the Brennan family had 2 young children and a husband who'd been sick since October. She hadn't mentioned it to Silas. He heard about it from Tom Brennan, who stopped him at the hardware store with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has been surprised by a kindness he wasn't expecting. Your wife, Tom said. She just stopped. Didn't ask, didn't make a thing of it. Just fixed it and drove on. That sounds right, Silas said. Tom seemed to be struggling with the sentence. You got a good one, Silas. Silas looked at him. I know, he said, and then quietly, to himself on the walk back to the wagon. I'm starting to know. The shift in town opinion was not universal. Mrs. Yount remained unconvinced, and 2 of the businessmen who ran alongside Kane's interests in Hatchford had no interest in changing their position. But the middle of Hatchford, the farmers and the tradespeople and the families who had known Silas since he was a boy, moved, almost imperceptibly but definitely, towards something that was at least neutrally accepting of Vivian Mercer, and occasionally verging on something warmer. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't particularly track it. She was occupied. In the 3 weeks after she'd told Silas about Voss, she had written 4 letters, to whom, she didn't say entirely, but she mentioned a lawyer in Cheyenne she trusted, and a contact in Chicago who had access to federal records. She spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table going through the documents in the leather case with a precision that reminded Silas of a surveyor measuring a piece of land. Nothing trusted to memory, everything laid out and verified. She also, in this same period, introduced the first of what would eventually become several significant changes to how the ranch operated. She came to Silas one morning with a hand-drawn diagram on a sheet of paper that she set on the kitchen table beside his coffee. "The cooperative market in Clearwater," she said. "It runs on the third Saturday of every month. Most ranchers in this area sell through the brokers who come to them. They set the price, they take the margin, the rancher gets what's left." She pointed at the diagram, which mapped the Mercer property's projected output against what the cooperative market was paying versus what the brokers paid. "The difference on our current herd size is somewhere between $30 and $50 per delivery." "That's real money," Silas said. "It's real money we could be keeping instead of giving to a middleman." She paused. "The issue is the drive. It's a day and a half each way if the weather's bad." "I've done it." "I know you have. I'm saying we should do it consistently, not just when the numbers are favorable." She looked at him. "And I think we should talk to the Brennans and the Hollister family about whether they'd consider joining a shared arrangement. If 3 ranches coordinate their deliveries, the drive makes more sense for everyone and the volume gives us a better negotiating position at the market." Silas looked at the diagram. He thought about Tom Brennan's dazed expression at the hardware store. "Tom Brennan's been sick," he said. "He might be interested in an arrangement that takes some of the logistics off him." "I thought so too," Vivian said. "I'd like to talk to him." "I'll go with you." She looked at him briefly, slightly surprised, he thought, and then not. "Good," she said. They went to the Brennan place on a Thursday afternoon, and Tom Brennan listened to Vivian's proposal with the careful attention of a man who couldn't afford to miss a good idea, but also couldn't afford to bet on a bad one. His wife, Mary, sat at the kitchen table with a baby on her hip and listened without saying anything for a while, which turned out to be because she was doing the math in her head. "Third Saturday," Mary said. "That's when my sister's family usually visits." "I can adjust the schedule," Vivian said. "The cooperative runs Friday evenings as well, though the prices are slightly less favorable." "How slightly?" 4 to 6%, based on the last 6 months of records, still better than the broker price by 20%. Mary Brennan looked at her husband. Something passed between them, the compressed communication of people who have been married long enough to talk without talking much. "We're in," Tom said. The Hollister arrangement took more work. Frank Hollister was 62 and had been doing things a particular way for 30 years and was not immediately receptive to the suggestion that there might be a better approach. He listened to the proposal at his kitchen table with the expression of a man being told something he didn't want to hear. "I know the broker system," he said. "I don't know a cooperative arrangement." "You'd still control your own stock and your own decisions," Vivian said. "All you're sharing is the logistics of the drive and the volume advantage at the market. Nothing changes about how you run your operation." "Except who I'm working with." "Yes," she said. "Except that." Frank looked at Silas. "You trust this?" "I trust her," Silas said. It was the first time he'd said it out loud in exactly those words, and it settled somewhere in him as he said it. Frank looked between them for a long moment. 2-month trial, he said finally. "If the numbers aren't better than broker, I'm out." "That's fair," Vivian said. The first cooperative drive happened in January on a day that was cold enough to make the work genuinely unpleasant but not dangerous enough to postpone. Silas and Tom Brennan and Frank Hollister, with 2 of Silas's hired hands, moved a combined herd to Clearwater over a day and a half, and Vivian handled the market negotiation herself, which she had asked to do and which Silas had agreed to despite some uncertainty about how the market men would receive a woman doing the talking. They received her with a condescension that lasted approximately 4 minutes, until she started quoting current price points across 3 comparable markets with a precision that made 2 of them look visibly uncomfortable. She got a better price than any of the 3 ranches had individually received in the previous 6 months. Frank Hollister, on the drive back, said to Silas, "Where'd she learn to do that?" "I'm still figuring that out," Silas said. "Well," Frank chewed on the inside of his cheek for a moment. "She's something." January gave way to February, and the ranch's numbers looked different from how they'd looked in October. Not fixed. That was still a long way away, and Silas had no illusions about how much distance remained between where they were and where they needed to be before the debt with Meridian Capital became unmanageable. But different. Progressing in a direction. It was in the 3rd week of February that Kane came back in person. He came without the hired men this time, which was either a sign of goodwill or an insult depending on how you read it. Silas read it as an insult. Kane showing up alone meant he considered Silas not worth the muscle. He rode into the yard at noon on a Wednesday, which was a time he would have expected to find Silas working and perhaps Vivian occupied elsewhere. Vivian was in the yard. She had been repairing the gate on the north fence when Kane rode in, and she did not stop doing it. She drove the last nail home, set the hammer down in her toolbox with a deliberate click, and looked at Kane with an expression that gave him nothing. "Mrs. Mercer," Kane said, touching his hat with the particular courtesy of a man who uses courtesy as a tool. "Is your husband about?" "He's in the barn," Vivian said. "Was he expecting you?" "I thought I'd drop by informally." "Nothing you do is informal, Mr. Kane," she said. Her voice was pleasant and completely level. "I'll get him." She went to the barn, and Silas came out to find Kane still mounted, which was another kind of rudeness. You dismounted when you came to a man's property, unless you were communicating that you didn't intend to stay long enough to be offered hospitality. "Mercer," Kane said, "debt transfer went through, as you know. I wanted to come by personally to discuss the repayment terms." "The terms are in the original loan documents," Silas said. "Nothing about the transfer changes the terms." "I have some flexibility on timing," Kane said, "given the situation." He glanced at Vivian, who had not gone back inside but had returned to the toolbox and was doing something that did not require her immediate attention. "An extension on the quarterly payments, if you are willing to discuss a partial sale. I've told you I'm not selling. You told me that 3 months ago. The situation has changed." "The situation has changed in my direction," Silas said. "Our numbers are up. The debt-to-output ratio has improved significantly since November." Something in Kane's expression shifted, just slightly. Not quite surprise, but close to it. He had not expected that. "I heard you were moving cattle through Clearwater," he said. "Cooperative arrangement." "You heard right. That's a precarious model," Kane said. "Dependent on other ranchers holding their commitments. If one of them pulls out or runs into trouble, then we adjust," Vivian said from behind the toolbox. Kane looked at her. He looked at her for a moment in the way of a man recalculating something. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "you've been making some inquiries in Clearwater, the county offices." "I'm a property holder in this county," she said. "I have every right to access public records." "Nobody said you didn't." His voice stayed smooth. "I'm just noting that some of what you are looking at might give people the wrong impression." "Of what?" "Of me," he said. "Of my operations. Of the relationship between my interests and others' interests." He smiled, and the smile was the worst part of him, practiced and pleasant and containing nothing genuine. "I'd hate for a misunderstanding to create unnecessary friction." Vivian set down what she was holding and looked at him directly. "Then there's an easy solution," she said. "Don't give people reason to look." The smile stayed on Kane's face, but something moved behind his eyes. He looked at Silas. "Think carefully about your position," he said. It was addressed to Silas, but it was meant for both of them. "Extensions have limits." He turned his horse and rode out. Silas and Vivian stood in the yard and watched him go. The north wind came across the ridge and pushed a skiff of snow along the ground between them, and neither of them moved until the sound of the hoofbeats was gone. "He knows I was looking," Vivian said. "He found out quickly." "What does that mean?" "It means he has someone in the county offices who tells him things." She bent and picked up her hammer. "It also means he's paying more attention than I hoped. Should we be concerned?" She turned the hammer over in her hands. "We should be moving faster," she said. That night she wrote 2 more letters, one to the lawyer in Cheyenne, one to someone she addressed only by initials that Silas didn't recognize. She sealed both carefully, and the next morning she was up before him, as always, and the letters were gone when he came down to the kitchen, already taken to the post. He poured his own coffee and stood at the window looking at the south pasture, which was starting, just barely, to show the first signs of what Vivian had predicted. The bunch grass coming back along the western edge where they'd done the first round of clearing in January, faint and green under the snow, but there. She came in from feeding the chickens with cold on her coat and a color in her face that the outdoor work put there, and she looked at where he was looking and said, "Another month and you'll be able to see it from the road." "Another month," he said. She poured herself coffee and stood beside him at the window, not quite next to him, but near enough that he was aware of the warmth of her through the air between them. They stood like that for a moment that had no particular shape, not awkward, not significant, just 2 people looking at something that was slowly getting better after a long time of getting worse. "The letters," she said. "If something happens, if Kane moves on the debt before I can get the right information to the right people, there are instructions with the Cheyenne lawyer, about the documents, about what to do with them." "If something happens to you," Silas said. If something happens to me, she agreed, or to both of us. He thought about that. He thought about a woman who had been moving for 2 years and planning for the worst case and still managed to fix gates on people's property as she passed. Nothing's going to happen, he said. He didn't entirely believe it. He said it anyway. She looked at him. You don't know that. No, he said, but I'm planning for it anyway. Outside, the south pasture grass pushed through the snow, patient and determined, the way things grow when they've been given half a chance. The grass came back the way Vivian had said it would. By mid-March, the western edge of the south pasture had enough recovery that Silas moved 6 head of cattle onto it on a rotating basis, the way she had explained. 2 weeks on, 2 weeks resting, giving the root systems time to consolidate before the next grazing. He'd done rotational grazing before, in a loose way, the way his father had done it. More instinct than system. What Vivian introduced was system. Written schedules. Map sections. Specific numbers tied to specific outcomes. He was not a man who had previously kept written schedules for cattle rotation. He was becoming one. The cooperative arrangement had its 3rd successful run in late February, and Frank Hollister's 2-month trial had converted without much ceremony into an ongoing commitment. Frank didn't say anything grand about it. He came by the ranch on the first Saturday of March, handed Silas a bottle of whiskey from a batch his cousin made in Laramie, and said, "Tell your wife the numbers were right," and left. Silas told Vivian. She said good, and went back to what she was doing, which was drafting a letter to 2 other ranching families in the Eastern Valley she thought might benefit from joining the arrangement. That was the version of their life that felt like progress. Steady, accumulated, the ranch breathing a little easier each week. The debt to Meridian Capital sat over everything like weather. Present, factored into every calculation, but not yet breaking through the ceiling. What broke through the ceiling first was the letter from Cheyenne. Vivian's lawyer there, a man named Aldous Crane, who she had described as careful, experienced, and expensive, had been sitting with the documents she'd sent him since January. His letter arrived in the 2nd week of March and was addressed to Vivian specifically, which Silas noticed and left unopened on the table for her to find when she came in from the afternoon feeding. He watched her read it without intending to watch. She was at the table with the lamp turned up and her coat still on because she hadn't taken it off yet, and she read the letter twice, which she did with important things. The second time through, her expression shifted in a way he'd learned to identify. Not alarm exactly, but something tightening around the edges of her composure. She set the letter down and looked at the wall for a moment. "What does it say?" Silas asked. "Crane has been making inquiries through a colleague in the federal district office in Denver," she said. "He's confirmed the connection between Meridian Capital and the Voss Holding Company. It's documented now. Not just something I found in property records, but something an attorney has verified through official channels." She paused. "The issue is that the federal office in Denver is aware of Voss, has been for some time. They've been building a case." That sounds like good news. It is, and it isn't. She looked at him. If they've been building a case, it means they have investigators involved. And if they have investigators involved, there's a possibility that Voss knows they're watching, which means he's also moving faster, trying to finalize assets before the case reaches a point where he can't. She picked up the letter again. "Crane says the Denver office wants to talk to me directly, in person." "In Denver?" "Yes." Silas thought about what that meant. Vivian, 2 days' travel from Hatchford with the leather case and its documents in a city where Voss had connections and where, if someone in the federal office was less careful than they should be, word could travel. "When?" he said. "He wants to arrange it within the next 3 weeks. She folded the letter along its original creases. "I told you when I came back from Clearwater that we needed to move faster. I wasn't wrong about that." "I'll come with you," Silas said. She looked at him. "You don't need to—" "I'll come with you," he said again. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, which was the closest she came to accepting something without making it complicated. "We'll need to arrange coverage for the ranch." "Tom Brennan's oldest boy has been looking for work since December," Silas said. "He's competent." "I know," Vivian said. "I already talked to Tom about it." He should have been surprised. He wasn't. "When?" "Last week. I wasn't certain we'd need him, but I wanted to know if he was available." She looked slightly, not guilty exactly, but aware that she had moved ahead of him. "I should have mentioned it." "You should have," he said. Not harshly, just factually. "I'm used to managing things alone," she said. It was as close to an apology as she was going to get, and he understood that. "I know," he said. "We're not doing this alone." She looked at the table. Something in her expression shifted again. The thing that wasn't calculation and wasn't steadiness, but was underneath both of those things, the older and more tired thing. "No," she said, quietly. "We're not." They arranged to leave for Denver in the second week of April, which gave them 3 weeks to get the ranch into a state where young Pete Brennan could manage it with minimal crises. They spent those 3 weeks working at a pace that Silas hadn't sustained since before Clara died. Sun up to after dark, the kind of sustained physical effort that leaves a person too tired in the evenings for much beyond the necessary. It was in those evenings, too tired for ceremony and too keyed up by everything that was coming to simply go to sleep, that they talked the most. Not about Voss or the documents or Denver. They'd said what needed to be said about those things. They talked about other things. The ranch. His father. The way the property had looked before the debt and the grief had worked on it. "What was it like when you were a boy?" she asked one night. It was late March, cold rain coming down outside, the kind of rain that sounded like a comment on everything. "Different," he said. "More cattle. My father had a full crew in summer. 4 men, sometimes 5. The south pasture you've been working on was the best grazing section on the property." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. He was proud of it. Not in a way he talked about much. He wasn't a man who talked about things much. "Where does that come from in you, do you think?" she said. Dry, almost not a question. "Probably him," Silas said. She smiled at that. A real one, not the careful, professional version. It caught him the way it occasionally did, direct and unguarded, and then gone quickly, like she'd noticed it happening and pulled it back out of old habit. "What was your mother like?" she asked. "Practical," he said. "She grew things, kept the books, managed the household accounts without ever making my father feel managed, which was a considerable skill." He paused. "She would have liked you." He hadn't planned to say that. It came out too directly, and he watched her receive it. The slight shift in her posture, the moment before she answered. "That's a kind thing to say," she said. "It's a true thing," he said. "That's different." She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight, and he did not look away, and the rain came down outside, and then she said, "Tell me more about the south section, before the scrub." He told her, and they talked until the lamp burned low, the way people talk when they've stopped managing what they say and started just saying it. 3 days before they were supposed to leave for Denver, Rutherford Kane made his next move. It didn't come in person. It came through the mail, a formal legal notice delivered by the Hatchford postmaster, addressed to Silas Mercer and filed simultaneously with the county clerk's office in Clearwater. Meridian Capital, acting as debt holder, was initiating a formal inquiry into the validity of the Mercer marriage on the grounds that the marriage had been conducted without full disclosure of relevant financial circumstances, and requesting a federal review of the land title's ownership status. Silas read it at the kitchen table. He read it a second time to make sure he understood what he was reading. Then he took it outside and found Vivian in the barn and handed it to her without saying anything. She read it. Her jaw tightened once, briefly, and then was still. "He's trying to invalidate the marriage," Silas said. "Yes." "Can he do that?" "Not easily," she said. "But he can create enough legal uncertainty to freeze the title, make it impossible to sell, to refinance, to do anything with the property while the inquiry is pending, which creates pressure." She folded the notice carefully. "And it gives him a public narrative, a fraudulent marriage, a woman with suspicious origins, a rancher who was deceived." She looked at him. "It's not about winning the legal case. It's about making the story ugly enough that you want to walk away." "I don't want to walk away." "I know that," she said. "He's betting that I do." That landed in a particular way. Silas looked at her, at the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes and the way she held the legal notice with both hands like she was keeping it from doing something. "Do you?" he said. He had to ask it. She looked at him squarely. "No," she said. "I am done walking away from things." He believed her, not because she sounded certain, she always sounded certain, but because something underneath the certainty had changed in the weeks since December. She had stopped looking at the road the way she'd looked at it in those first weeks. He hadn't noticed when it happened exactly. He noticed now that it had. "Then we answer it," he said. "We answer it," she agreed. "Through Crane, we document everything, the marriage, the circumstances, the legitimacy, and we accelerate the Denver meeting." She went inside and wrote to Crane that afternoon. Silas went to Hatchford and spoke to Judge Peabody, the same man who had married them in 11 minutes that November afternoon, who confirmed that the marriage was entirely legal and offered, with the weariness of a man who had seen Kane operate before, to provide a sworn affidavit to that effect. "Kane's been at this since the Reedy family," Peabody said. "Never thought he'd try this particular angle, but I can't say I'm surprised." He signed the affidavit with the deliberate, precise movements of an old man who knew the weight of his signature. "Give this to your lawyer." "Thank you, Judge." "Thank your wife," Peabody said. "She's the one who made you worth fighting for, from what I can see." Silas took that home and turned it over in his mind for a while without deciding what to do with it. The departure for Denver was moved up by 4 days. They left on a cold April morning, Pete Brennan in the yard watching them go, with the slightly terrified expression of a 19-year-old who has just been left responsible for a moderate-sized cattle operation. Vivian had spent 2 hours with him the previous day going over every contingency she could think of, written instructions for the most likely problems, and the Brennan and Hollister families on notice to check in every other day. If the heifer in the south pen goes off her feet again, it's usually the water quality from the lower creek, she told Pete. Move her to the north trough. Yes, ma'am. And don't let Frank Hollister talk you into moving the east fence line. He's been wanting to do it for 2 months and it will cause more problems than it solves. Yes, ma'am. If anything catches fire, Vivian, Silas said. She stopped, looked at Pete. You'll be fine, she said. Which was either reassurance or instruction, possibly both. The stage to Cheyenne, then the train to Denver. Silas had been on the Denver train twice in his life, both times for livestock business, and both times he had found the city slightly overwhelming in the specific way of a man whose natural scale is wide open spaces and small populations. Denver was neither of those things. Vivian, to no one's surprise, navigated the city with the ease of someone accustomed to urban environments. She knew which streets connected to which, how to speak to hotel clerks in the way that got results without confrontation, the city's geography from its architecture and its traffic patterns. She also, Silas noted, kept track of who was behind them on every street they walked. "You're watching the crowd," he said, on the second day there. "I'm always watching," she said. "In cities, it matters more." "Has anyone followed us?" "Not that I've seen." She paused. "That doesn't mean no." Aldous Crane's office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of old paper and linseed oil and the specific gravity of accumulated legal problems. Crane himself was 60, compact, with the kind of face that had probably been unreadable since approximately age 30. He greeted Vivian with a professional warmth that suggested he'd worked with her before, in some form, which Silas filed away without asking about yet. He looked at Silas with a brief, appraising quality and said, "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming." "He insisted," Vivian said. There was something in how she said it that was not quite pride and not quite amusement, but was in the neighborhood of both. "Good instinct," Crane said, and left it there. The meeting with the federal investigator happened the following morning in a building whose exterior gave no particular indication of what happened inside it. The investigator was a woman named Hargrove, first name offered only as M, which she did not expand upon, who was perhaps 45, dressed in the practical dark clothing of someone whose work required movement, and who had the specific quality of attention that Silas associated with people who were very good at listening for the thing behind the thing being said. Vivian spread the contents of the leather case on the table between them. "These are the original documents," she said. "Corporate registrations, financial correspondence, land transfer records. This section," she indicated a stack secured with a leather tie, "is correspondence between Voss and intermediaries that details the structure of the land acquisition operation. This section is the financial trail connecting Meridian Capital to the Voss Holding Company. And this," she indicated a smaller envelope sealed, "is something I kept separate because I wasn't sure of its full significance until Crane's inquiry confirmed the federal timeline." Hargrove looked at the sealed envelope without touching it yet. "What's in it?" "Letters," Vivian said. "Personal correspondence between Voss and a man named Fournier who managed the Gulf shipping operation. They reference, obliquely but clearly, the nature of the cargo on 3 specific shipping routes that did not appear in any official manifest. Crane's colleague in New Orleans has been able to confirm that 2 of those routes overlap with known smuggling operations." Hargrove looked at Crane, then at Vivian. "Where did you get these letters?" "From Voss's study," Vivian said, "in his house in New Orleans before I left." The room was quiet for a moment. "You took documents from his personal study," Hargrove said. "Yes." "Without his knowledge." I was planning to force me into a marriage I did not consent to and use my family's legal standing to launder money, Vivian said, with a steadiness that Silas found remarkable given what she was saying. I took what I could reach and I left. I'm not sorry about it. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the sealed envelope and opened it. She read in silence for 3 minutes. Then she set it down, looked at the ceiling briefly, and said, "We're going to need to bring more people into this conversation." The next 2 days in Denver were the longest Silas had spent in a contained space since the winter he was 14, and a blizzard had kept the family inside the ranch house for 11 days. He and Vivian spent hours in Crane's office, in Hargrove's building, in a hotel room in the evenings, going over everything that had been said and everything that might happen next. He was not a man who was comfortable in these proceedings, the legal language, the structured questions, the way everything had to be documented and confirmed and documented again. He was useful in the moments that required plain speaking, which happened more than he expected. When Hargrove's colleague, a younger investigator named Pierce, tried to question whether the Mercer marriage had been a genuine arrangement or a legal convenience, Silas looked at him with the flat directness of a man who has run cattle through harsh weather and said, "She fixes fences and she tells me when I'm wrong and she's kept my ranch from going under. You can call that whatever you want." Pierce did not pursue the line of questioning. On the third evening, in the hotel room, Vivian sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on and her hands in her lap and said, "This is the part I was afraid of." He had been by the window, looking at Denver's evening lights in the way of a man who would strongly prefer a horizon without buildings on it. He turned. "Which part?" he said. "The part where it becomes real and I can't manage it anymore from a distance." She looked at her hands. "For 2 years I've been carrying this by moving, staying ahead of it. When you're moving, you don't have to feel like catch up." She was quiet for a moment. "Now I've stopped. Now it's here." He came across the room and sat down in the chair across from her, because sitting next to her felt like a decision he didn't have the right to make without being asked. "What are you feeling?" he said. He was not experienced at asking that kind of question. He asked it anyway. She looked up. Something in her expression was different. The tiredness more visible, the careful steadiness a little thinner than usual. "I'm scared," she said. "I have been for a long time, but I've been busy enough not to notice it as much." A pause. "I notice it now." He thought about Clara, about grief, about the particular quality of fear that comes not from the unknown, but from a threat you understand completely because you've been living alongside it for so long it's become a kind of company. "I know what that's like," he said. "The noticing." She looked at him. "When Clara died," he said, "for the first few months I was managing. There was always something to manage. The arrangements, the ranch, the people who came, and then one day there was a quiet afternoon and nothing needed doing and I noticed all of it at once." He stopped. "I didn't talk about Clara often, and saying this out loud felt like touching something that was still tender. It nearly finished me, that afternoon." Vivian was very still. "It didn't," he said, "finish me, but it was the hardest afternoon I remember." He met her eyes. "What I'm saying is, noticing isn't the same as being finished." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She reached across the space between the bed and the chair and put her hand briefly on his arm. Not a gesture of romance, not that kind of thing. Just a hand on an arm, the way a person touches someone to confirm they're actually there. "No," she said, "it isn't." She took her hand back after a moment and straightened, the steadiness reconsolidating the way she did when she'd been briefly somewhere else and came back. "We should go over what Hargrove said about the timeline tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he said. They went over the documents instead, and it was almost 11 before they were done, and the hotel room was cold and the Denver street noise was strange and nothing about it was comfortable. But it was, in some way he couldn't quite name, all right. They came back to Hatchford on a Friday afternoon to find the ranch in functional shape, Pete Brennan looking both exhausted and quietly proud, and the heifer from the south pen in the north trough exactly as instructed. "No fires," Pete reported. "Good man," Vivian said. "Mr. Hollister came by about the east fence." "I know," she said. "I'll speak to him." She paid Pete what they'd agreed, and added something extra from her own pocket, and Pete rode home with the particular posture of a young man who has done a real thing and knows it. The news from Denver moved faster than Silas had expected. Within 2 weeks, Crane sent word that Hargrove's investigation had formally widened. The evidence Vivian had provided was enough, combined with what the federal office had already assembled, to initiate formal proceedings against the Voss Holding Company and its subsidiaries. Meridian Capital was specifically named. The inquiry into the Mercer marriage was stayed pending the federal action. Kane didn't know any of this yet, or if he did, he was playing it carefully. What Kane did in the third week of April was send Teague to 3 of the neighboring ranching families with a proposal to buy their operations at slightly above market value, a move that read to Vivian as someone trying to consolidate before the doors closed. "He's scared," she said, when Silas told her what he'd heard from Tom Brennan. "Kane doesn't seem like a man who scares." "Everyone scares when they feel the edges closing in," she said. "He's trying to convert liquid assets. Buy properties while he still can, before the federal connection to Meridian freezes his operations." She looked at the map she'd pinned to the kitchen wall. Hatchford, the neighboring properties, the routes to Clearwater and Denver marked with small X's. "If he gets Brennan and Hollister, the cooperative falls apart and we lose our market position." "Then we need to talk to Tom and Frank before Teague does," Silas said. "I already have," she said. "Yesterday." He looked at her. She had the slight expression of a woman who knows she's moved ahead again and is waiting to see how he receives it. "I sent word yesterday morning when I heard about Teague. Tom said no immediately. Frank took an hour and then said no." She paused. "I should have told you." "You should have," he said, for the second time since December. "I know," she said. For the second time. He thought about it. The habit of operating alone, the 2 years of managing everything without a second person, the reflexes of a woman who had survived by being faster than the people trying to catch her. "When this is over," he said, "we're going to have to work on that." "When this is over," she said, like the phrase itself surprised her. Like over was a country she'd been traveling toward for so long she'd almost stopped believing in it. She turned back to the map. "He'll try something else," she said. "Kane. He's not the kind of man who takes no from tenant farmers and small ranchers without escalating." "What do you think he'll do?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map, at the X's, at the lines she'd drawn connecting the properties and the routes. "I think," she said slowly, "that he'll reach back to whoever is above him." She turned to look at Silas. "I think he'll tell Voss that there's a problem in Wyoming." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the late April wind was doing something complex with the cottonwood branches, a sound that was halfway between the last of winter and the first of something better. "And then Voss comes," Silas said. "And then Voss comes," she said. She said it without flinching, without looking at the door, without any of the careful sideways glances at the road that had been part of her first weeks at the ranch. She said it looking directly at Silas, her hands flat on the table beside the map, standing in her kitchen in a house that had her name on the deed. It was the first time he understood completely what she had meant when she said she was done running. Voss arrived on a Tuesday. He did not come the way Kane came, loud with hired men and folded documents and the theatrical confidence of a man who uses intimidation as a first language. He came quietly, the way water comes into a basement, without announcement, finding the lowest point, and by the time you noticed it, already deeper than you wanted. Silas heard about it from Dale Morrow at the hardware store, who had heard it from the Clearwater stage driver, who had seen a party of 4 men check into the Hatchford Hotel on Monday evening. A man of perhaps 50 in an expensive coat, accompanied by 3 others who did not look like they worked in offices. The expensive coat and the 3 others had taken the 2 best rooms and eaten dinner without speaking to anyone unnecessary and had been seen by the hotel owner's wife looking at a folded map spread across the restaurant table. Dale told Silas this with the tone of a man delivering information he considered important but did not entirely understand. Silas thanked him, finished buying what he'd come for, and drove back to the ranch at a pace that suggested urgency without announcing it. Vivian was at the kitchen table with the ledger when he came in. She looked at his face and closed the ledger. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She was quiet for a moment, not the calculating quiet, but something stiller and more internal. The way a person goes quiet when something they've been dreading for a long time finally steps through the door and becomes real. 4 men, she said. That's what the stage driver told Dale. Voss doesn't travel with muscle unless he plans to use it. He's not... She stopped, started again. He presents himself as a legitimate businessman. The men he travels with are usually kept at a distance, handled through intermediaries. If he's brought 3 with him personally, it means he's come to close something. Close it how? Silas said. She looked at her hands on the table. He wants the documents, and he wants to make sure I don't talk to anyone else about what I know. A pause that was just long enough to carry weight. Those 2 things may or may not require the same solution. The room was cold in the specific way of a spring that hasn't committed to warmth yet, and the stove needed another log, and Silas stood in the doorway of his kitchen, looking at his wife, who had been carrying this particular weight for 2 years and had finally put it down in a place where it had turned solid and real and immediate. "We need to send word to Crane," he said. "Already done," she said. She looked up. "I sent the letter 4 days ago. When Teague was going to the neighboring ranches, when I understood Kane was escalating, I wrote to Crane and to Hargrove both. I told them if Voss moved, it would be fast." She held his gaze. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to—" She stopped. "Frighten me," he said. "I didn't want to bring it into the house until I had to," she said. It was slightly different from what he'd said and more honest. "I've been managing the edges of this for long enough that I default to managing alone. I know. You've told me." "I'm not angry," he said. He wasn't. What did Hargrove say? She said they would move when there was actionable reason, that they needed Voss on Wyoming soil doing something that could be documented. Vivian stood up. "I think 4 men and a map of local properties in a hotel restaurant qualifies. Can you reach her from here?" "I'm going to the telegraph office in town," she said. "Now. Tonight if it's still open." "I'll drive you." She was already reaching for her coat. The telegraph office was open until 8, and Vivian wrote her message to Crane's Cheyenne office in the careful, compressed language of someone who understood that telegraphs were not private and who had long practice at saying important things without saying them directly. Silas stood by the door while she worked, watching the street with a casualness he did not entirely feel. The operator sent the message, and Vivian paid him, and they drove back to the ranch without talking much. The night was clear and cold, the stars doing their indifferent work overhead, and the road home felt different than it usually did. Narrower somehow, the darkness at its edges slightly less familiar. "When he comes," Silas said at the turnoff to the ranch road. "If he comes," Vivian said, "he may send someone first." "When someone comes," Silas said, "I want to be the one who talks to them." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you've been the one talking to everyone for long enough," he said. "And because if Voss comes to my property, he's coming to my property." She was quiet for a moment. "You understand that this isn't just about being stubborn." "I know what it's about," he said. "He is not a man who responds to stubbornness. He responds to leverage and legal standing." "Which we have, but which requires being careful about." "Vivian," he said. She stopped. "I understand the situation," he said. "I've been understanding the situation since December. Let me be a part of it the way a man should be a part of things happening on his own land." Another pause. Longer. "All right," she said. He drove them home. The next morning brought an unwanted visitor before breakfast. Not Voss. Not yet. Teague, Kane's man, thin-faced and unremarkable, came to the ranch door at 7:15 and waited to be answered with the patience of someone paid to be patient. Silas answered it. Vivian stood at the kitchen stove behind him, not invisible, not hiding, just present. "Mr. Kane would like to arrange a meeting," Teague said, "at your earliest convenience. He's prepared to discuss restructuring the debt obligations in a way that—" "Where?" Silas said. Teague blinked. He'd expected either argument or the opening of a negotiation. "I beg your pardon? Where does Kane want to meet?" "His office in Hatchford. Tomorrow morning, if that—" "Fine," Silas said. "Tell him tomorrow at 9. Teague left. Silas closed the door and turned around to find Vivian looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "You want to know what he's been told," she said. "I want to know how much Kane knows about what we did in Denver and what Hargrove's office has." He went to the stove and poured coffee. "If Voss arrived Monday night and Kane is arranging meetings Tuesday morning, there's a conversation that happened between those two things." "You think Kane is scared?" "I think Kane was told something that changed his calculation," Silas said. "Whether that's fear or just repositioning, either one is useful information." She poured her own coffee. "What do you want me to do while you're at the meeting?" "I want you to go to the Brennan place and the Hollister place and tell them what's happening. Not everything. As much as you think they need to know to make a decision about whether they want to stay in the cooperative arrangement through whatever comes next." He looked at her. "They deserve to choose." She studied him. Yes, that's right." Something in her expression shifted, the way it did occasionally when he said something she hadn't predicted. "Tom will stay regardless. Frank might need convincing." "Frank always needs convincing," Silas said. "That's why it means something when he does it." The meeting with Kane happened the next morning in an office above the hardware store that smelled of pipe smoke and ambition. Kane was behind his desk when Silas arrived, which was the power position, and Silas sat down across from him without being offered the chair, which was the other power position. They looked at each other for a moment. "Mercer," Kane said, "thank you for coming." "You called the meeting," Silas said, "so talk." Something flickered in Kane's expression, the slight adjustment of a man recalibrating. He had expected something more manageable. He usually did. "I'm prepared to offer a significant restructuring," Kane said. "Extended payment schedule, reduced interest during the extension period, and, in exchange for a 20% equity stake in the ranch, a full forgiveness of the existing default status." Silas looked at him. 20% of my ranch. 20% gives you access to Meridian's capital network. In practical terms, that means... "I know what 20% means," Silas said. "It means you have a legal foothold on my property. It means when the rest of Meridian's arrangements fall apart, my land is attached to them." He let that sit for a moment. "The answer is no." Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The federal inquiry into the marriage is stayed," Silas said, "as of last week, which I think you already know, which is why we're having this conversation instead of the other kind." A longer silence. "Your wife has been busy," Kane said, and the pleasantness was mostly gone from his voice now. "My wife and I have been busy," Silas said. "Together, which is how married people work, generally." Kane looked at him. The calculation in his eyes had changed quality, still calculating, but differently, like a man who has been playing a board game and has just understood that the other player has been playing a different game on the same board. "There are people involved in this situation," Kane said carefully, "who have a long reach and a long memory. I'm offering you a way out that doesn't put you in their direct path." "You're offering yourself a way out," Silas said. "You're scared. You came to this county acting as an independent operator, and now you've figured out that the man above you in the chain has come to Wyoming in person, which means the situation has moved out of your control and into his, and that's not a comfortable place for a man like you." He stood up. "We're done here. If you want to make another offer through Crane's office, that's the appropriate channel." He walked out. He sat in the wagon for a few minutes before driving, his hands on his knees, the adrenaline of the meeting working through him the way it does when you say the right thing in a high-stakes room and don't know until afterward whether it was brave or stupid. Then he drove back to the ranch. Vivian was there when he arrived, along with Tom Brennan, who had driven over after her visit and wanted to talk in person. Frank Hollister's wagon was in the yard too, which Silas had not expected. He came into the kitchen to find all three of them at the table with coffee and an expression on Frank's face that was the closest thing to resolved that Silas had ever seen on it. "Tell me about this Voss person," Frank said, by way of greeting. Silas looked at Vivian. She gave a small shrug that meant, "I told them enough." He understood. He sat down and told them the rest of it. The organized structure behind Meridian Capital. The federal investigation. The documents Vivian had carried for 2 years. He told it plainly, without dramatizing, the way he would have explained a bad situation with the water rights or a disease moving through the herd. Serious, factual, here's what we know. When he finished, Frank sat with it for a moment. "So this Kane has been acting on behalf of a larger operation the whole time." "That's what it appears," Silas said, "and this larger operation is now in Hatchford." "At the hotel," Vivian said, "as of Monday." Frank looked at Tom. Tom looked back. Then Frank said, "What do you need from us?" It was not the question Silas had expected, and the directness of it hit him somewhere he didn't entirely have words for. "Visibility," Vivian said, before Silas could answer. "The more people who publicly know about this situation, the harder it is for Voss to do anything in the dark. He operates through intermediaries and distance. Personal exposure is what he avoids." She looked at both men. If word spreads through the valley, not rumor, but documented fact through the right channels, the situation changes for him. "What kind of documented fact?" Tom said. "The cooperative," Vivian said. "Our arrangement, the purchase records. The proof that this ranch has legitimate, profitable, legal operations with community partners. That's different target than a failing ranch with a questionable marriage and an isolated owner." She paused. "He came here expecting to find something that would disappear quietly. We need to make sure we can't disappear quietly." Frank was quiet for a moment. "The mill owner in Clearwater has been wanting to know about the cooperative model," he said. "He's got 3 ranching families he works with regular. Been asking since January whether they could join." He looked at Silas. I told him I'd think about it. Stop thinking about it, Silas said. Frank nodded once. All right. Tom put his hat on. I'll talk to the Kellermans and the Wrights. They've had their own trouble with Kane's people, though they don't know to call it that. He stood up. Give me 2 days. They left. The kitchen was suddenly quiet again, the particular quiet of a room where something had shifted. Vivian stood up and started clearing the coffee mugs with the efficiency of someone whose hands needed something to do. You told them more than I expected, Silas said. They deserve to know what they were staying in, she said. What Frank said about the Clearwater Mill families, that's 6 more ranches. 6 more legitimate operations with documented purchasing histories connected to ours. She set the mugs in the basin. Foss can make 1 ranch disappear. He can manufacture a problem with 1 marriage. He can't manufacture a problem with 12 ranches operating cooperatively with documented federal attention on the land transaction patterns in this county. You planned this, Silas said. Not an accusation, more like recognition. I hoped for it, she said. Planning requires more certainty than I had. She turned around. The truth is, I didn't know Frank Hollister would sit down at that table. I didn't know Tom would come over without being asked. I made the arrangements I could and hoped the rest would follow. He looked at her, at the tiredness she was still carrying and the steadiness over the top of it, and the way she'd been running contingency plans inside her head for so long it had become the way she moved through the world. You don't have to keep doing everything yourself, he said. I know, she said. I'm practicing. Foss made his move on a Friday. He did not come to the ranch, which Silas had half expected and half prepared for. Instead, he came to town to Judge Peabody's office with a lawyer who had been brought from Denver specifically for the occasion. A man named Whitfield who wore 3-piece suits and spoke with the precision of someone billing by the hour. The legal action Whitfield filed on Friday morning was a federal civil complaint naming the Mercer Ranch title as encumbered property connected to a fraudulent marriage and an ongoing federal investigation. It was, as Vivian explained to Silas when she read the filing, mostly theater. He's trying to create a public record of the complaint before Hargrove's investigation moves far enough to name him specifically, she said. If he files first, if he establishes himself as the aggrieved party in a public document, it changes the narrative. Can he make it stick? Not with what Hargrove has, but that's not the point. She set the filing on the table. The point is the newspaper. There's a reporter from the Clearwater Gazette who's been in Hatchford for 2 days. Foss's man arranged it. Whatever gets filed in Peabody's office tomorrow morning becomes the story in the Gazette on Monday. Silas looked at the filing. Then we need a different story in the Gazette by Monday. She looked at him. Crane, he said. Can he get a statement to the reporter? Something that puts the federal investigation on record publicly before Whitfield's complaint runs? Something shifted in her expression, quick and bright and then steadied. Yes, she said. If I telegraph him tonight. Telegraph him tonight, Silas said. She had her coat on before he finished the sentence. What happened Saturday morning in Hatchford was the kind of thing that small towns remember for a long time. Not because it was violent or because anyone famous was involved, but because the scale of it was unexpected. The Clearwater Gazette reporter, whose name was Josephine Marsh and who was 26 years old and considerably more thorough than anyone had anticipated, had received Crane's statement Friday night by a telegraph and had also, apparently, been making her own inquiries about the land transfer patterns in the valley for several weeks based on a tip from someone she declined to name. What she printed on Saturday, in a special edition that reached Hatchford by noon, was not Voss's complaint. It was a documented account of Meridian Capital's debt acquisition pattern across 4 Wyoming counties, its connection to a New Orleans holding company under federal investigation, and the cooperation of multiple local ranching families in providing the documentation that had been forwarded to federal investigators in Denver. The names of the ranching families were listed. Silas read his own name in print and felt something strange happen in his chest. Not pride exactly, but a kind of solidity. Like something that had been formless, had taken a shape he could put weight on. Vivian read it standing in the kitchen, not sitting, as though sitting would require a commitment to stillness she didn't have yet. When she finished, she set the paper on the table and was quiet for a long moment. Marsh did this herself, she said. Crane gave her the statement, but the investigation into the land patterns, that was her. Someone tipped her, Silas said. Vivian looked at him. Pete Brennan's father, Silas said. Tom. He mentioned the mill owner. I think the tip came through those conversations. He paused. I think when you told them enough to make a choice, one of them made a bigger choice than you knew about. She was quiet for another moment. I didn't plan that, she said. No, he said. Sometimes things go right. The publication of the article did several things simultaneously, like a stone dropped into still water with the rings all moving at once. The Hatchford Town Council called an emergency session. The Clearwater County Clerk's office received 3 separate requests for property record access before noon. Dale Morrow at the hardware store reportedly ran out of copies of the Gazette by 1 o'clock and had to get more from Clearwater by Saturday evening. And Voss came to the ranch. He came at 3 in the afternoon, without Whitfield the lawyer, without all 3 of the men he'd traveled with. He brought one, a large, quiet individual who stayed by the horses while Voss walked to the front door, which was either restraint or a calculation about appearances, and Silas could not immediately determine which. How was precisely what his letters and reputation suggested. A man in his early 50s who had the smooth, contained quality of wealth that has been held long enough to feel natural, not flashy, not loud, the kind of dangerous that wears good clothes and speaks in even tones. Silas answered the door. Voss looked at him with the brief, appraising quality of a man accustomed to rapid assessments. Mr. Mercer, I'd like to speak with your wife. My wife isn't available, Silas said. I'm here, Vivian said from behind him. Silas turned. She had come from the kitchen. He hadn't heard her, and she was standing in the hallway with her arms at her sides and a quality of stillness that he recognized as the most controlled version of herself, the version that appeared when the stakes required everything held in reserve. She looked at Voss. Whatever she felt at seeing him was not visible on her face, but her right hand had closed around nothing, the way a hand closes when it needs something to hold, and there's nothing there. Silas stepped to the side but did not step away. He stayed at the threshold. Voss looked at Vivian for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Not warmth, nothing like warmth, but something that might have been, a long time ago, the shape of where warmth could have existed. You've caused a significant amount of difficulty, he said. You caused it first, she said. I just documented it. The federal case is not what you think it is, he said. The investigation is manageable. What is not manageable is a public narrative that my attorney cannot contain. He paused. Come back to New Orleans. Bring what you took. We can resolve this in a way that doesn't require anyone to go to prison. You mean in a way that doesn't require you to go to prison, she said. I mean a way that protects everyone involved. His voice stayed even. Including you. He glanced at Silas. Your arrangement here. It's not an arrangement, Vivian said. It's a marriage. Those are different things. Vivian, you came here to offer me something in exchange for the documents and my silence, she said. I understand that. The answer is no. It was no before you got here. She held his gaze. The documents are already with federal investigators in Denver. Copies are with 3 separate legal offices. What I took from your study 2 years ago is no longer something you can recover by talking to me. She paused. You came here for nothing. Voss looked at her for a long moment. The even quality of his expression had changed, not broken, but strained, like something held under too much pressure for too long. The man you've attached yourself to, he said, nodding toward Silas, has no idea what kind of enemy you've made. He has a reasonable idea, Silas said. Voss looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. This doesn't concern you, Voss said. It's my land, my wife, and my front door, Silas said. I'm having difficulty understanding how it doesn't concern me. Something happened in Voss's expression. Not respect exactly. A man like that didn't get to respect in one conversation, but a recalibration. He had arrived at a ranch in Wyoming expecting a woman who could be frightened and a man who could be managed, and he had found something he hadn't entirely prepared for. You're making a mistake, Voss said, addressed to neither of them specifically and both of them generally. We'll see, Vivian said. He turned and walked back to his man by the horses, and they rode out, and Silas and Vivian stood in the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the noise of the spring wind in the cottonwoods. Then Vivian let out a breath that she had clearly been holding for a while. Are you all right? Silas said. I don't know yet, she said. She was looking at where the horses had gone, her arms still at her sides, her right hand still half closed. Ask me in an hour. He did not put his arm around her. He stood next to her in the doorway, close enough that she could feel he was there, and looked at the same empty road she was looking at. He'll try something else, she said after a moment. Hargrove needs to move fast, Silas said. I know. She turned and went inside to the telegraph. Hargrove did move fast. The federal marshals arrived in Hatchford on Sunday morning, 4 of them, with a 5th who identified himself as the lead investigator from the Denver office. They had warrants. The warrants were for Voss, for Whitfield the lawyer, and for 2 of the men who had traveled with Voss, who had records in 3 separate federal jurisdictions that predated Wyoming entirely. They also had a warrant for Rutherford Kane. Kane was found in his Hatchford office at 8 in the morning, which was either because he worked on Sundays or because he had not slept, and was taken into custody with the flat, hollow expression of a man who had spent months building a careful structure and had watched it collapse so quickly that he hadn't even had time to run. Voss was at the hotel. I was not surprised when the marshals knocked. A man who has operated at the edge of legality for as long as Voss had developed, as a survival mechanism, the ability to recognize when the end had arrived. He did not resist. He said something to the lead investigator in a tone that Silas, who was not present but who heard about it from 3 different people by the end of the day, was told was almost philosophical. What Voss said, reportedly, was, "The woman always had better instincts than I gave her credit for." Silas heard this and thought about Vivian at the county records office in Clearwater. Vivian at the hotel in Denver spreading documents across a table for Hargrove. Vivian standing in the kitchen in November asking how bad the South Pasture really was, as if bad was just a starting point and not a verdict. He thought about the letter he had sent to the placement agency in Chicago, honest to the point of blunt, no particular charm to speak of, and the photograph he'd put face down on the table. He thought, she had better instincts than I gave her credit for too, and I should have figured that out faster. Whitfield the lawyer was arrested at the stage depot, apparently having decided quite early Sunday morning that Hatchford was no longer where he wanted to be. The 5th warrant, the one for Voss's quiet companion, was served at the hotel before anyone checked out. By Sunday afternoon, the arrests were the only thing anyone in Hatchford was talking about, which was saying something given that the Gazette had already given them significant material. Josephine Marsh was everywhere, taking notes with the focused intensity of a person who knows they are in the middle of something that will define a significant portion of their career. She found Silas at the ranch late Sunday afternoon, where he had gone because there were still animals that needed feeding regardless of what was happening with federal warrants in town. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'd like to speak with you and your wife if you're willing." "Come inside," he said. Vivian made coffee. Marsh asked her questions with the careful, direct quality of a good journalist, and Vivian answered them with the same careful directness, giving enough to be useful and withholding the things that were still part of active proceedings. Silas answered the questions addressed to him in the same way he always answered things, plainly, without embellishment, more honest than strategic. "What made you decide to stay?" Marsh asked him at one point, "when you found out what was involved. Some men would have—" "It's my ranch," Silas said, "and my wife." He paused. Didn't seem like a complicated decision. Marsh wrote something down. Vivian, across the table, looked at him with an expression he would remember later, when he tried to reconstruct what had changed between them and when. After Marsh left, they sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of a Sunday evening that felt entirely different from every Sunday evening that had preceded it. The crisis was not completely over. There would be proceedings, testimony, months of legal follow-through before everything was settled. Crane had made that clear. Hargrove had made it clear too. But the immediate pressure, the thing that had been sitting over the ranch like weather that wouldn't break for months, had broken. The air felt different in it. "It won't be simple from here," Vivian said. "No," Silas said, "but it'll be ours to deal with." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was on between them. The same lamp that had been on when she'd spread the documents and when they'd gone over the ledger and when she'd written letters late into the night. The same kitchen. Different weight in the air. "I owe you an apology," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "For the things I didn't tell you when I should have. For making decisions without you that were yours to make too." She held his gaze. "I said I was practicing. I haven't been practicing well enough." "You've been practicing for 2 years of doing everything alone," he said. "That doesn't unlearn in 4 months." "No," she said, "but I want to unlearn it." He looked at her. She was tired in a way that went deeper than the Sunday after a hard week, the kind of tired that accumulates over years and only lets itself be felt when the emergency is over. And she was, despite that tiredness, or maybe because of it, entirely present in a way she hadn't been in the early weeks at the ranch, when part of her was always watching the road. "Vivian," he said. She waited. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Not a question. Not quite reassurance either. Something more like a statement of the way things were, the way the South Pasture coming back was a statement of the way things were. Factual, grounded, something you could point to. She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "I'm not." Outside, the spring evening was doing its slow work, the light going gold and then gone, the cattle settling in the pastures, the cottonwoods doing their new leaf thing along the creek. The ranch was quiet in the way a thing is quiet after a long, complicated effort has concluded, and the work that comes after it hasn't started yet. Silas poured 2 more coffees and pushed one across the table without asking. She picked it up. The legal proceedings took the better part of 4 months. That was the part nobody told you about when the crisis ended. That ending was not actually ending, but rather the beginning of a different and considerably more tedious kind of difficulty. The marshals made their arrest on a Sunday in April, and by the following Thursday, there were attorneys involved in quantities that Silas found genuinely staggering, and the paperwork generated by the federal case against Voss and his network would, Crane told them matter-of-factly, fill several filing cabinets before it was done. Silas and Vivian testified in Denver in May. The trip was different from the April one, less fearful, more procedural, which turned out to have its own particular exhaustion. They sat in federal offices and answered questions for 2 days, separately and together, going over the same events from different angles with the patience required of people who understand that the process matters even when it's slow. Hargrove ran the sessions with the same careful attention she'd shown in April, and Pierce, the younger investigator who had questioned the marriage's authenticity, had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable when Vivian entered the room. On the second day, during a break in the proceedings, Vivian and Silas sat in a hallway on a wooden bench that was built for function rather than comfort, and ate sandwiches from a paper bag Vivian had thought to bring, which Silas had not thought of and was grateful for. "How much longer do you think?" he said. "Today is the main session," she said. "Crane says the rest will be written submissions." She handed him the second half of her sandwich without asking whether he wanted it. He'd noticed she did that. Anticipated the practical things without making a performance of it. "The criminal trial for Voss won't be until fall at the earliest. We won't need to testify for that. Our depositions are sufficient." "And Kane?" "Kane is cooperating," she said. "Crane says he's providing everything he knows about the Meridian structure in exchange for a reduced charge." She said it without satisfaction, which he thought was honest. Kane had caused them real damage, and reduced charges felt inadequate against that. But what Kane knew about Voss's operation was valuable enough to be worth the trade. It means the case against Voss is stronger. "That's what matters," Silas said. She looked at him. "You're not angry at Kane." "I'm tired of being angry at Kane," he said. "I've been angry since October. That's a long time." She was quiet for a moment, chewing. "I've been angry for 2 years," she said. "At Voss, at my father, at the situation." She looked at the hallway's far wall. "I've been so angry for so long it started feeling like one of my organs. Something I just carried around and forgot was unusual." He thought about that. He thought about grief working the same way. The way it becomes so familiar, it stops feeling like grief and starts feeling like just the air quality of a particular life. "When did it start to feel different?" he said. She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she considered things. "January," she said, "the first cooperative drive, when Frank Hollister said the numbers were right." She paused. Something about that, other people's ordinary lives continuing to work, made the anger feel less necessary. She looked at him. "And sometime before that, the barn roof." He remembered. His hands on the edge of the eaves, legs dangling, the drop below him suddenly very real. Her voice from the ground. "Don't let go." "You held the ladder," he said. "You came down," she said. "You could have told me to step back and figured it out yourself. You didn't." He hadn't thought of it as a decision at the time. It had just been the obvious thing. "It was faster with 2 people," he said. "Most things are," she said. They went back into the proceedings when the break ended, and by the time the Denver trip was over and they were on the train back to Cheyenne, Silas felt something he hadn't entirely expected, a cautious, tentative sense of it being behind them. Not resolved, not settled, but behind them in direction. The way you can feel that a storm has passed even before the sky is fully clear. June came, and with it the particular quality of Wyoming summer that managed to be both brutal and beautiful at the same time. The heat, the long light, the grass in the south pasture standing full and green, which Vivian walked through one morning with her hand trailing through the tops of the stems in a way she probably didn't realize he was watching. He was watching from the barn door. He watched her do it for a moment and then went back to work, because some things were better noted quietly than made into something larger than they needed to be. The ranch was different by June, not transformed. He was too honest for that word, and transformation implied something completed, and a working ranch is never completed, but meaningfully different. The south pasture restored. The cattle numbers up by 30% from October's low. The cooperative had grown to include the Clearwater Mill families Frank had mentioned, and the combined purchasing volume had allowed them to negotiate terms with 3 separate buyers that none of them could have managed individually. The debt to Meridian Capital had been, through the federal proceedings, transferred to a resolution trust. Crane had negotiated the terms over 2 months of careful, document-heavy work, and the result was a payment schedule that the ranch could more than meet, given the improved income, without the threat of seizure or foreclosure. It was not free money. It was not forgiveness. It was just terms that a functioning ranch could manage, which was all Silas had wanted since October. He paid the first installment in June, drove to the Resolution Trust representative in Clearwater himself, and handed over a bank draft with the particular feeling of a man returning something he'd borrowed and had not been sure he'd be able to give back. He sat in the wagon outside the trust office for a minute after, doing nothing, just sitting. Then he drove home. Vivian was at the kitchen table when he came in, writing a letter. She had correspondence she kept up with. Crane, Hargrove's office for the ongoing case, and several others whose names Silas knew by now. She was also, he had discovered in the past month, writing to 2 women she had not mentioned before. Women who had been in situations similar to hers, connected to Voss's network in different ways, who had been identified through the federal investigation, and who had reached out to Crane's office looking for someone who had been through it and come out the other side. She had told Silas about this carefully, watching his face as she explained it. He had listened and then said, "That makes sense." And she had looked at him the way she sometimes did when he said the obvious thing in a way she hadn't expected. "First installment," he said now, coming into the kitchen. She looked up. "Done?" "Done." She put down her pen. "How does it feel?" "Like a thing that needed doing that got done," he said. He poured water from the pitcher and drank it standing at the counter. "Also like I want to not do that drive again for a while. Clearwater's not that far. It's far enough when you're carrying a bank draft you worked since October to earn." He turned around. "What are you writing?" "To Ellen Marsh," she said, "one of the women from the investigation." She looked at the letter. "She's in Cincinnati. She was one of Voss's creditors. Her family had a shipping interest he used as leverage. She lost most of it." She was quiet for a moment. "She has 2 daughters and no clear path back to what she had. I've been thinking about what I might do to help her that's actually useful and not just sympathetic." Silas sat down across from her. "What are you thinking?" "The compensation the federal court has assigned from Voss's assets, the portion directed to victims of the fraud operation." She had explained this to him in May. As part of the resolution of the case, assets seized from Voss's legitimate businesses would be distributed to those who had suffered documented losses. The amount assigned to Vivian as a primary witness and documented victim of Voss's coercive practices was significant, more than Silas had expected when Crane first mentioned it. "I'm not keeping most of it," she said. She said it in the tone of someone stating a decision already made, not asking for approval, but also, he noticed, not hiding it from him either. The practicing she'd talked about. "How much is most?" he said. "Enough to clear the remaining debt schedule completely and put a reasonable reserve into the ranch account." She met his eyes. "The rest I want to put toward Ellen Marsh and 2 other women in similar situations. And something for the Brennan family. Tom's wife has been wanting to expand their kitchen garden to something that could actually sell at the cooperative market, but they don't have the starting capital." He looked at her. "You've thought this through." "I've been thinking about it since Crane gave us the number in May," she said. "I kept waiting for the right moment to bring it up." "This is a fine moment," he said. She looked slightly relieved, which was unusual enough on her face that he noticed it. You don't have an objection?" "Why would I object? It's a significant sum." "It's your sum," he said. "You earned it by carrying those documents for 2 years and standing in that doorway when Voss came." He held her gaze. "And helping Ellen Marsh is the right thing. You know it's the right thing, or you wouldn't have decided on it before telling me." She looked at him for a moment. "You're occasionally very straightforward in a way I find surprising." "I've been told," he said. She picked up her pen, then she set it down again. "Silas," she said. He waited. "I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly." She was looking at the table. choosing words the way she did when they mattered. When I came here, I was honest with you about what I was looking for. Somewhere to stand. Legal ground. A permanent place. She looked up. I told myself that was enough to be honest about. That the practical arrangement was sufficient and I didn't need to examine it more closely than that. He was very still. I was wrong about that, she said. Not about the honesty. I was honest, but about what was sufficient. She paused. What we have is not what I planned for. I didn't plan for someone who goes back into the barn. I didn't plan for any of this. She gestured slightly at the kitchen, the window, the ranch beyond it, all of it. I planned for a place to stop running. I didn't plan for... She stopped again. For it to feel like home, he said quietly. She looked at him. Yes, she said. For that. He thought about the photograph he'd put face down on the kitchen table in October. He thought about all right, said twice. He thought about the night in the Denver hotel when she'd put her hand briefly on his arm to confirm he was there, and how that small thing had stayed with him. I didn't plan for it either, he said. What I had before, Clara, I thought that was something I'd had and lost and wouldn't have again. Not in the same way and not in any other way. He turned the water glass in his hands. I was wrong about that too. She was looking at him with the unguarded expression, the real one, not the careful version, not the steadiness over tiredness, the one that appeared occasionally and then usually pulled back before he'd had enough time to see it clearly. This time it didn't pull back. We should probably keep being honest with each other, she said, about these things, going forward. Probably, he said. I'm still practicing, she said. I know, he said. So am I. She picked up her pen again, and he sat across from her while she finished the letter to Ellen Marsh, the summer light coming through the kitchen window at the particular angle it reached in mid-June, the ranch quiet outside in the way. It was quiet when everything that needed doing had been done for the moment and the next thing hadn't started yet. The compensation funds were distributed in July through Crane's office. Ellen Marsh wrote back from Cincinnati within 2 weeks, a letter that Vivian read at the kitchen table and then folded and held in her hands for a long moment without saying anything, and Silas did not ask what it said, because he could see from her face that it said something true. Mary Brennan's kitchen garden expansion happened in August, and by September she was selling surplus vegetables through the cooperative market with the focused satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting for the specific opportunity to do exactly this kind of work. She brought Vivian a jar of preserved tomatoes in September and said, without preamble, Tom told me what you did. I'm not good at these conversations, so I'll just say, thank you. Vivian took the tomatoes and said, put the money back into the next season's seeds. That's the thank you I want. Mary Brennan laughed, which was apparently not what she'd expected to do, and left. Vivian put the tomatoes on the kitchen shelf and stood looking at them for a moment. You're not going to say anything, she told Silas, who was by the door. What would I say? He said. Something straightforward, she said. You usually do. You did a good thing, he said. That's all there is to say about it. She looked at the tomatoes. I keep waiting for it to feel like enough, she said. The good thing. For it to cancel out. Not what Voss did. I don't mean that. I mean what I didn't do for 2 years. The women who were still in that situation while I was running. The ones I didn't know about because I wasn't looking. He thought about that carefully. Because it deserved care. You can't make up for time you didn't have and resources you didn't have, he said. You were surviving. Surviving is not the same as being selfish. He paused. What you're doing now, Ellen Marsh, Mary's Garden, the others, that's not debt repayment. That's just what you do when you can. She was quiet for a moment. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, he said, but you're making it harder than it needs to be, which you sometimes do. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was partly exasperation and partly something warmer. You're doing that straightforward thing again. I can't help it, he said. Frank Hollister came by in September with news that the cooperative had been contacted by a buyers association in Cheyenne interested in a long-term supply agreement, something that would guarantee minimum prices across participating ranches for 2 years and provide the kind of stability that individual ranch operations rarely had access to. Frank stood in the yard and delivered this information with the expression of a man who has remained skeptical long enough to be genuinely surprised when something works out. It's your wife, he said to Silas. The Gazette article. Josephine Marsh ran a follow-up piece about the cooperative in July. The Buyers Association read it. You should tell her, Silas said. I'm telling you because she's going to act like it's not a big thing, Frank said. I've noticed she does that. Acts like the things she did are just reasonable actions anyone would have taken. She does do that, Silas said. It's not, Frank said. Reasonable, I mean. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have taken the money and kept quiet and let the rest of us deal with Kane indefinitely. He looked at his boots for a moment. I've been stubborn about saying this, and I'm saying it anyway. We'd have lost the Hollister place inside 3 years if things had kept on the way they were going. Kane was working his way toward us. He looked up. So, Silas agreed. Tell her, Frank said. Then he got in his wagon and left, which was exactly the kind of conversation Frank Hollister was comfortable with, one that ended before it could become anything more. Silas told Vivian. She received it the way Frank had predicted, with a brief acknowledgement and then a pivot to the practical question of whether the Buyers Association terms were favorable enough to warrant a meeting and what they'd need to bring to that meeting in terms of production figures and quality documentation. Silas let her get most of the way through this before he said, Vivian. She stopped. Frank Hollister drove over to tell you that, he said. Frank Hollister, who took 2 months to commit to the cooperative and has never in his life, as far as anyone in this valley can remember, driven somewhere specifically to say something kind. She looked at him. Let it land, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face, the thing she usually managed before it became visible, but this time it moved through fully, all the way to the surface. Her eyes went bright for just a second and then steadied. All right, she said, quietly. All right, he said. The Buyers Association meeting happened in October. 1 year, nearly to the week, from the afternoon Silas had stood at the bank with Aldrich and understood how bad things had gotten. He drove to Clearwater with Vivian and Frank and Tom Brennan and the mill owner from Clearwater whose name was Garrett, and they sat across a long table from 3 men from the Buyers Association, and Vivian presented the cooperative's production numbers, quality records, and pricing history with the precision of someone who had been building toward exactly this moment for 12 months. She had not told Silas she was nervous. He knew anyway, from the way she'd been at the kitchen table the night before, going over the figures, which she already knew by heart, going over them again anyway, which was what she did when the stakes felt high. He had made coffee without being asked and sat at the other end of the table and read nothing in particular, just present in the room. She hadn't said anything about that either. She hadn't needed to. The agreement was signed in October. 2-year supply contract, minimum pricing, quarterly adjustments for market conditions. When the Buyers Association representative slid the document across the table and Vivian signed it, clear and precise, the same hand that had signed the marriage document in Judge Peabody's office 11 months ago. Garrett from the mill operation let out a breath that had probably been held since the meeting started, and Tom Brennan looked at the table with the expression of a man doing mental arithmetic he liked the results of. On the drive back to Hatchford, Frank Hollister said, 2 years ago, I was thinking about selling. I know, Silas said. Not to Kane, just selling. Going somewhere else. 62 years old and a ranch that was grinding me down every season. He looked at the road. My father built that place. I didn't want to be the one who let it go. Nobody said anything for a moment. You didn't, Vivian said. No, Frank said. I didn't. He didn't say anything else about it. But that night, when Silas told Vivian what Frank had said about selling, the part he'd said to Silas in the yard that she hadn't heard, she sat with it for a long time. That's the part that matters, she said. Which part? Silas said. Not the contract, not the numbers. Frank Hollister's father's ranch still being Frank Hollister's ranch. She was looking at the lamp on the table. Ellen Marsh's daughters growing up knowing their mother recovered something. Mary Brennan's garden. She paused. The individual things. The specific people. You could argue the contract is what makes those things possible, Silas said. You could, she said, but the contract isn't why any of this matters. She looked at him. It matters because Frank drove over to say thank you, because Tom Brennan's oldest boy did a good job when we needed him to, and now has work experience he can build on, because Mary Brennan knows she can grow something worth selling. She stopped. That's what I didn't understand when I came here. I thought what I needed was legal standing, ground to stand on, and I needed that. That part was true, but the ground is just the beginning. He thought about his father building the ranch house with his own hands and dying proud of it. He thought about Clara naming the hills and talking to the cattle and keeping a kitchen garden through Wyoming summers by sheer stubbornness. He thought about what the ranch had been and what it had become and the distance between those two things, and how the distance had been covered not by any single decision, but by accumulated daily ones. Fences mended, ledgers balanced, gates rehung on neighboring properties, ladders held. My father used to say that land doesn't care who owns it, he said. It just responds to what you do with it. That's true, she said. What you do with it, he said. Not what you intend to do with it. Not what you planned, what you actually do every day. He looked at the table. I stopped doing things for a while. After Clara, the land showed it. He paused. And then you came and started doing things, and the land showed that too. She was quiet. The grass in the south pasture, he said. That's not a metaphor. It's just grass. But it's there because of what you did. And Frank's ranch is still Frank's ranch. And Mary Brennan has tomatoes to sell. He looked at her. That's what daily work is. It just accumulates into something you can stand in the middle of and look around. She looked at him for a long moment. You're doing the straightforward thing, she said. I can't help it, he said. Same as before. She smiled, the real one, fully present, not pulled back. I know, she said. I've stopped waiting for you to stop. Voss was convicted in federal court in November. The trial lasted 12 days and was covered by Josephine Marsh in the Gazette, with the thorough attention of a journalist who had been following the case from the beginning and understood its significance. The conviction included charges of financial fraud, conspiracy, and several additional counts related to the smuggling routes documented in the letters Vivian had taken from his study 2 years before. Whitfield, the lawyer, received a separate conviction. Kane's cooperation produced a significantly reduced sentence, which Silas found unsatisfying in a way he acknowledged was probably not entirely rational, but was human enough to feel anyway. Crane sent a telegraph when the verdict came in. Vivian read it at the kitchen table on a November morning. 1 year and a few weeks from the morning Silas had driven to the bank and come back with the understanding that everything was in trouble, and she read it twice, as she did with important things, and then set it down. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at the window, at the shoulder ridge visible in the distance, at the south pasture where the grass had gone to its winter gold. Done? Silas said. Done, she said. He watched her face. What he expected, what he thought he'd see, was relief, the kind that comes when a long-held tension finally releases. And there was some of that. But what was more visible and what stayed was something quieter than relief. Something more like the absence of a sound you've been hearing for so long you stopped noticing it until the moment it stopped. She had not looked at the road in months. He had noticed when that changed too. Sometime in late summer, the sideways glances had simply stopped, the way a habit stops when the thing that caused it no longer applies. She hadn't pointed it out. He hadn't either. It had just gradually been true. I owe you something, she said. He raised an eyebrow. The truth about one more thing, she said. That I've been not hiding exactly, not keeping, just not saying. He waited. The photograph. Photograph, she said. The one the agency sent you, before I came. He went still. I sent it to them, she said. The photograph was recent. I knew what I looked like, and I knew... She stopped, started again, which she almost never did. I knew that a woman traveling alone to a frontier territory to marry a stranger faced a particular kind of assessment. I wanted to give myself the best chance of being taken seriously as a practical partner. I used the photograph deliberately. She met his eyes. I'm not sorry I did it, but I should have told you before now. He looked at her. He thought about the photograph face down on the table. He thought about telling himself it didn't matter what she looked like. He thought about all the ways he'd been wrong about things and how most of them had turned out better than the thing he'd expected. You thought I'd judge you for being practical, he said. I thought you'd wonder if the whole arrangement was managed, she said. Orchestrated. Was it? The photograph, she said. Not the rest, she gestured again at the kitchen, the ranch, all of it. Not any of this. This I didn't engineer. He thought about that. The photograph was practical, he said finally. So was my letter. I told you I had no charm to speak of. That was also presentation management. She looked at him. That's different. Is it? He said. You used what you had. So did I. That seems like a fair starting point. She was quiet for a moment. You're not troubled by it. I'm troubled by exactly nothing about the way you arrived in Hatchford, he said. What I'm more interested in is that you're still here. She looked at him, that full, unguarded expression again. It came more easily now than it had in November or December or even June. He'd watched it become easier over the months, the pulling back happening less frequently and less completely, like a door that had been stuck closed for years gradually learning to stay open. "I'm still here," she said. "That's what matters," he said. Outside, the November light was doing its low-angle work on the pastures, the particular gold of late autumn afternoon in Wyoming that looks like the land is generating its own warmth even when the air is cold. The shoulder ridge was clear against the sky, the cattle in the north pasture visible from the kitchen window as dark shapes against the pale grass. The ranch was not the place it had been in October of the previous year, the desperate, debt-laden, half-neglected place that Silas had been fighting to keep out of grief and stubbornness and a not quite articulated sense that his father's work deserved better than to end quietly in foreclosure. It was also not a perfect place. The barn roof still had a section that needed attention come spring. The equipment was older than ideal. There would be another hard winter and another set of problems that came with it, and the Buyers Association contract would need renegotiating in 2 years, and Frank Hollister would be difficult about something again, and the south pasture grass would need continued management to hold what it had gained. None of that had changed. What had changed was the quality of facing it. He thought about the kind of mistakes you make when you're living alone inside grief. Not dramatic mistakes, not the kind of mistakes that make good stories, just the slow erosion of not having someone to measure yourself against, to correct your blind spots, to hold the ladder while you nail sheathing. He'd been making those mistakes for 3 years and hadn't fully understood what kind of mistakes they were until someone arrived and, by operating differently, showed him the shape of what had been missing. And she had her own version of that. 2 years of surviving so efficiently that efficiency had become the only mode available. So accustomed to managing alone, moving fast, keeping things at arm's length, that staying still and sharing a problem felt like a vulnerability she had to practice into. What they'd built over 11 months was not the arrangement they'd both thought they were signing up for. It was something harder to describe and more actual. The specific knowledge of how the other person operated under pressure. The particular comfort of a kitchen where someone else had already made the coffee. The shorthand of 2 people who have worked the same land long enough to communicate across yards without needing to raise their voices. The way trust accumulates, not all at once, not through declarations, but through 1,000 small demonstrations, 1,000 small choices, ladder holding and barn roof surviving and honest ledger reading and document carrying and driving to Clearwater and sitting in federal hallways and all the rest of it. That was the thing nobody told you about any of it, about loss and grief and starting over and trusting someone new. They told you about the dramatic moments, the crises, the turns that changed everything. They didn't tell you about the Tuesday afternoons in the kitchen, the unremarkable evenings, the ordinary mornings when the cattle needed feeding and the coffee was already made and the work was just the work, accumulating quietly into something you could stand in the middle of and recognize as yours. Silas looked at his wife across the kitchen table in the late November light, and she was writing a letter, and her coffee was going cold the way it did when she was concentrating, and her hair had come loose from its pins on one side in the way it did by afternoon, and she was entirely ordinary, and entirely herself, and entirely here. He got up and refilled her coffee without being asked. She looked up. "Thank you," she said. "The Hanson grain order needs to go out by Thursday," he said, "before the cold snap." "I know," she said. "I put it on the schedule." "Just checking." "You never just check," she said, but she was almost smiling, and she turned back to her letter, and outside the cattle moved in the north pasture, and the shoulder ridge held its position against the November sky, and the south pasture grass stood in its winter gold, and the ranch went on.